program, its ballistic missiles program, and its support for terror proxies. Iran's enriched uranium stockpile is still buried underground, and arrangements have yet to be agreed upon for its removal. Trump stated that Iran will not be permitted to enrich uranium and claims the U.S. would work with Tehran to remove that highly enriched material, but there's no confirmation from Iran it has accepted these terms. Vice President Vance said a deal is possible if Iran acts in good faith, but he warns that Washington retains significant leverage if negotiations failed or are undermined.
The president did is he basically issued an ultimatum to the Iranians. He said, open up the straits, stop trying to hold the world's economy hostage, and we'll engage in a ceasefire. And that's exactly the agreement that we came to last night. The Iranians have agreed to open up the straits. The United States has agreed to stop attacking. And not just the United States, but also our allies have agreed to stop attacking. And that is the basis of this fragile truce that we have, which is now, 8 to 12 hours old.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is publicly backing the announced two-week ceasefire, and he has committed to halting Israeli airstrikes on Iran. But Netanyahu is referring to the agreement as a temporary suspension of fighting. The Prime Minister's office said in a statement, Israel supports President's decision to suspend strikes against Iran for 2 weeks, subject to Iran immediately opening the straits and stopping all attacks on Israel, the U.S., and countries in the region. Well, the Israeli Air Force has not carried out any strikes in Iran since around 3 a.m. yesterday. That was following a final wave of attacks just hours before the ceasefire took effect. The IDF adds that in line with political directives, it has now ceased fire but remains on high alert and ready to respond to any ceasefire violations. Last night, Prime Minister Netanyahu addressed the nation to sum up Operation Roaring Lion.
יש לנו עוד יעדים להשלים, ואנחנו נשיג אותם, או בהסכמה, או בחידוש הלחימה. כי אנחנו ערוכים לחזור ללחימה בכל רגע שידרש. האצבע על ההדק. הלילה נכנסה לתוקפה הפסקת אש זמנית בת שבועיים בין ארצות הברית לבין איראן, בתיאום מלא עם ישראל. לא, הם לא הפתיעו אותנו ברגע האחרון. עכשיו אני מבקש להדגיש, זה איננו סיומה של המערכה. זו תחנה בדרך להשגת כל היעדים שלנו. וביחס לחומר המואשר שעדיין נותר באיראן. כפי שאמרו היום בכירי ממשל טראמפ, החומר המואשר יצא כולו מאיראן. או שהוא יצא בהסכמה, או שהוא יצא בחידוש לחימה. ואנחנו רואים עין בעין בנושא הזה. עכשיו אני עמדתי על כך, שהפסקת האש הזמנית עם איראן לא תכלול את חיזבאללה. ואנחנו ממשיכים להכות בו בעוצמה.
Well, as we just heard from Netanyahu, Israel is insisting that the 2-week ceasefire announced by the U.S. does not apply to the war against Hezbollah in Lebanon. President Trump called that conflict a separate skirmish, making it clear Lebanon was not part of the Iran ceasefire deal. Yesterday, the Israeli Air Force says it carried out its largest waves of airstrikes against Hezbollah since the start of the fighting, targeting around 100 sites. According to the IDF, the strikes hit locations in Beirut, the Bekaa Valley, and South Lebanon, including command centers, intelligence headquarters, and other military infrastructure used by the terror group. The military says the targets included facilities linked to Hezbollah's rocket, naval, and aerial units, as well as assets belonging to its elite Radwan force. The IDF described the operation as the most extensive strike on Hezbollah infrastructure since the beginning of Operation Roaring Lion, adding that many of the sites were deliberately located within civilian areas. Ahead of the strikes, evacuation warnings were issued to those civilians in targeted areas, including parts of Beirut's southern suburbs. The IDF says it also completed deployment along a strategic anti-tank defensive line inside South Lebanon. The military says troops are now fully positioned along a ridge several kilometers inside Lebanon, designed to prevent Hezbollah from launching anti-tank missile attacks on Israeli border communities in the north. The so-called anti-tank line is part of a aimed at removing threats to North Israel. IDF Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir has outlined a multi-layered defense concept, including clearing border villages of Hezbollah infrastructure and securing positions deeper into Lebanon to prevent infiltration and rocket fire. And Defense Minister Israel Katz also had this to say.
צה"ל תקף במהלומת פתע מאות מחבלי חיזבאללה במפקדות ברחבי לבנון. זוהי המכה המרוכזת הגדולה ביותר שסופג החיזבאללה מאז מבצע הביפרים. עמדנו על בידול הזירות בין איראן ללבנון כדי לשנות את המציאות בלבנון ולהסיר איומים מעל תושבי הצפון. הזנו את נעים קאסם שהחיזבאללה ישלם מחיר גבוה מאוד על תקיפת ישראל בשליחות איראן, והיום מימשנו עוד שלב בהבטחה. גם תורו האישי של הארכי-טרוריסט נעים קאסם יגיע. כוחות צה"ל ממשיכים לפעול בעוצמה בלבנון להרחקת איומים ולסיכול יכולות החיזבאללה בהתאם למדיניות אותה קנו. הבטחנו להביא ביטחון לתושבי הצפון וכך בדיוק נעשה.
And as the battle against Hezbollah goes on, another Israeli soldier was killed and 5 others were wounded during a clash with terrorists in southern Lebanon yesterday. The slain soldier is named as Staff Sergeant Tuvel Yosef Lifshitz, 20 years old, of the Golani Brigade's 13th Battalion. He comes from the city of Beit Shan, the town of Beit Shan. Lifshitz is the 12th soldier to be killed since fighting renewed with Hezbollah. May his memory be a blessing. And most Israeli schools reopened today as Home Front Command eased restrictions. The IDF Home Front Command has updated its guidelines, announcing schools will reopen most of the country that was started at 6 a.m. this morning. Under the new directives, limits on public gatherings are being lifted, signaling a broader easing of wartime restrictions following the announced ceasefire. However, in areas close to the northern border with Lebanon, existing restrictions will remain in place for now due to continuing security concerns. Israeli officials are cautiously moving toward a partial return to return to routine while monitoring the security situation, waiting to see if the 2-week ceasefire with Iran will hold. And Israel has also announced plans for a full resumption of operations at Ben Gurion Airport, with flights potentially returning to normal amid the ceasefire. Since the outbreak of the conflict on February 28th, Israel's airspace has been largely closed to commercial traffic, with only limited emergency flights operated by some Israeli airlines, including El Al, Arkia, and Israel. Arkia says it is preparing to resume a full flight schedule starting May 3rd, including to destinations across Europe, the US, and Asia, as demand for travel is expected to rebound. Meanwhile, the low-cost carrier Wizz Air says it will not resume its flights to Israel until at least April 27th, citing continued uncertainty. Most foreign airlines remain suspended despite the ceasefire. Israeli officials stressed that any full return to normal operations will depend on the security situation, with adjustments expected as the conditions here continue to evolve. Well, for more on all of this, we are joined now by Reserves IDF Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus. He's now a senior fellow with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and also Dr. Nimrod Novik from Commanders for Israel Security and Israel Policy Forum. He's a former foreign policy advisor and envoy for the late Shimon Peres. Jonathan, I want to just start with you. A lot to break down here, specifics, but first a general question. I think the big question everyone asks, what odds do you give that this ceasefire is going to last, even going to last until the 2 weeks is up?
Yeah, shalom, Kalev. It's a ceasefire that, could be a very slippery slope towards the Iranians doing what the Iranians excel at, and that is losing on the battlefield, but winning in diplomatic circles. My concern is that they will be able to fool American negotiators and to get what they want, and to be able to claim victory, and most importantly for them to live to see another day, and perhaps change the balance of power in the Middle East with regards to Hormuz, and that will be strategic leverage for them. That is what concerns me. So the ceasefire in itself is, less of an issue. Yesterday there was a lot of tough talk from the Iranian regime about they claimed that Hezbollah and Lebanon were allegedly part of the ceasefire, which was refuted by American officials. And how I responded to that is that if they really believe that Lebanon and Hezbollah are part of the ceasefire, by all means, put your money where your mouth is, and let's see if you really mean that it was supposed to be part of it, which we know that it wasn't. And I don't think that they will. But it's interesting to see, of course, monitoring closely the traffic of containers and oil and gas in the Hormuz Strait. It doesn't appear to be open. And the big question is, how long will the Americans and the world say, okay, we have a ceasefire, but the Iranians are not fulfilling the very basic condition of it. How long are we going to tolerate the Iranians doing what they usually do, lie, deceive, and use diplomacy in order to get out of trouble?
Dr. Novik, your response, we can get into some specifics further on, but I think Jonathan's raising a basic issue here. Basically, that the Iranian regime simply can't be trusted to keep any conditions of agreement. They're not going to negotiate in good faith. Do you share that concern? Do you see any possibility for some kind of agreement coming out of these negotiations?
Look, the vicious Iranian regime has proven itself to be quite astute at negotiating. When they struck an agreement, which was not easy to accomplish, they stuck with it to the letter. As the IAEA confirmed, after the JCPOA, the nuclear deal was concluded in 2015, and until President Trump decided to pull out of it, and even for a year later, the Iranians stuck with the agreement. So the Iranians are tough to get an agreement with, but, to suggest comprehensively without reservation that they don't live up to agreements, I think is a bit of a stretch. I'm worried at the moment, perhaps more than Jonathan, that both sides are right, and therefore that there is something flawed in the preliminary negotiations conducted to bring about the ceasefire. It was not only the Iranians that claimed that Lebanon is included, it was also the mediator, Pakistan. So the U.S. said no, Iran said yes, the mediator says yes, and I wonder whether different texts of those mysterious 10 points have been circulating and left room for very dangerous misunderstandings.
Okay, John, this would not be the first time that different texts of an agreement were circulated to parties. I can even think of some examples here in Israel, such as, for example, during the Gaza negotiations. But Jonathan, let's start to, even if that is the case, let's start to look at some of the specifics. I think for Israel, certainly, the biggest has to be, in terms of Iran, let's say, the nuclear issue, not just the question of enrichment, but the fate of that enriched material, which is still in Iran or perhaps buried underground there. Are you concerned that the U.S. may come to some kind of an agreement short of having that material actually removed, or on some of the other issues relating to the question of enrichment?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting, study in communications and looking at, using the number 10 and 15, and then saying, we, the Iranians, passed a list of 10 or 15 demands, and then having the president speak about a list of the same number. But again, nobody knows what the number entails. And then the Iranians, spin masters, deceivers, and liars, and dishonest negotiators, as they have proven to be, will try to spin and say, well, the demands that we have set forward, which are outlandish, absurd, and totally disconnected with reality in terms of the list of the demands that they have given out, they are the ones that are the basis for negotiations. If that is the case, if the Iranian list, the 10 points of Iranian demands are the basis for negotiations, we are indeed in dire straits. I don't believe that they are, and I don't believe that this president is a fool or naive and will be, even entertain the list that the Iranians put forward. Yes, you're right. Enrichment on Iranian soil is a very basic issue here that must be totally denied. Also, the safe removal of the remaining enriched material. Of course, the risk here being that the Iranian regime, in its desperation, as the noose tightens around its neck, either by the US and Israel or by the Iranian people, will use that enriched material in order to deliver a dirty bomb, a sub-level nuclear device, but nevertheless a nuclear device, and then try to get themselves out of trouble. Hence the importance of making sure that they don't have that ability now, and denying them the right and the ability to enrich on Iranian soil to make sure that it doesn't proliferate in the future. So those are very important topics, nuclear speaking, but there's a whole bounty of things. And Hormuz, I was quite surprised that the prime minister spoke about Hormuz, because Hormuz isn't really Israeli business. It doesn't really affect Israel too much, not our economy, not our oil, not our resources. And yeah, it's leverage for the Iranians, but Hormuz wasn't really an objective to begin with. It became a topic after the Iranians closed it, which I think is an odd way of now for Israel looking at the things that are important and speaking about the important things. Front and center, enriched material, ballistic missiles, their missile industry, and their ability to provide weapons and funding to terror organizations like Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad. That is front and center for Israel.
For Israel, but we know that it's President Trump who is going to call the tune here. But let me ask you how Israel should be approaching it, how the government should be approaching it. I mean, should Prime Minister Netanyahu be setting out these kind of red lines in these talks, while perhaps lacking the leverage to force President Trump to concede? How much should he go public on? As Jonathan said, for example, raising an issue like the Strait of Hormuz, and how much should he have to be satisfied with really speaking to President Trump behind closed doors in private conversations? This has been an issue of debate between certainly different political sides here in Israel. Dr. Novik, your take.
Yeah, I completely agree with Jonathan that we're dealing here with two different sets of issues in terms of importance. The issue of the 15 points that the Americans presented and were no starters, and the 10 points that the Iranian presented and were no non-starters, somehow shrunk into another 10 that we are not privy to. And we don't know what's written in there. The only thing we do know is that there is a disagreement about the issue of Lebanon. And that the Iranians claim that their 10 points, which Trump has accepted as a premise for negotiations, including the right to enrich, which I doubt very much. So one thing is that the 10 points that are circulating somewhere are a basis for doubting the durability of the ceasefire unless creative diplomacy resolves those lingual formulations, starting points for negotiations. It is far more profound, the issue of the nuclear material, the highly enriched, as well as the know-how that they do have at home, the know-how and capability and outside help that they are likely to get in order to reconstitute their ballistic missile program, and their support for proxies. On all three issues, the jury is at best out. Thus far, none of the three have been accomplished. I hope the negotiations do resolve at least the one that is critical. All of them are important, but one is critical, which is the nuclear issue. And on your specific question, yeah, I think that the prime minister is sufficiently experienced and he knows President Trump very well. So he knows that in public, he should demonstrate no daylight between them, and in private, he can press his case.
Right. And let's now look specifically at an issue you raised, Jonathan, and the fact of the agreement, at least according to the U.S. and Israel, does allow for Israel to continue its operations in Lebanon against Hezbollah. But you have to imagine the longer the ceasefire holds with Iran, and perhaps if it goes to a permanent agreement, there'll be growing pressure on Israel to at least scale down those operations again in Lebanon and reach some kind of point where it said we've achieved its aims? Has those aims been sufficiently delineated? Is Israel close to achieving those aims?
Yeah, the way I see it, we have a challenge here that is comprised of two main components. One is the real battlefield, where it'll take a lot of time, in my military assessment, to degrade Hezbollah sufficiently and to affect their will to fight, their command and control, and the level of support that they have from the local population. That is an effort that will take weeks, if not months, to really degrade and to try to weaken Hezbollah, soften Hezbollah to such an extent that the Lebanese armed forces will have the ability, the political cover and the local cover to actually go in and do what they've been saying and hoping and dreaming about doing for the last 15, 20 or so years, which is to actually implement Lebanese sovereignty in their country. The second issue is information and communications. And I see a tremendous void here in terms of Israeli strategic communications to the West and to the Lebanese audience, where Israel is communicating, but it's communicating mostly domestically and to Hezbollah. But two very important target audiences, the Western countries who currently are piling up pressure on Israel. France, UK, and other European countries have officially said, we want Lebanon to be included in the Iranian ceasefire, which of course is quite absurd. But that is what they're saying. And Israel is, again, conducting good, solid, actually quite magnificent military operations based on intel and based on tremendous strike capabilities. What Israel did yesterday was quite, high level in terms of striking so many targets simultaneously, surprise effect, and taking out quite a lot of capabilities. However, the strategic sum isn't enough because we are not communicating it well enough. And two important audiences, the Lebanese population and leadership, non-Shiite, and the West, are left without really effective Israeli strategic communications. And we've been in this situation in the past. We know that we are very good on the battlefield. We do tremendous things thanks to our pilots and Mossad and IDF troops on the ground. But then where we many times fall short is turning victories and achievements on the battlefield into strategic diplomatic gains that last us a long time. And I really wish Israel would communicate better, clearer, and a more diverse way to other important audiences.
Right. Actually, Dr. Novick, since you have experience with diplomacy, let's pick up on that point of Jonathan's about making strategic diplomatic gains, because there has been questions raised whether Israel should be trying to engage the Lebanese government or looking for other ways internationally to pressure them or provide them with the capability to finally live up there to the agreement that they signed last year to disarm Hezbollah. And is more enough being done Jonathan is saying on the battlefield? Sufficient. The work is being done, less so in the strategic communications. What about the diplomatic sphere?
Yeah, I think that's the primary flaw in the Israeli government's policy on Gaza as well as in Lebanon and Syria. The fact that we are far superior militarily is not in doubt. It's almost like a NBA all-star team fighting with my Ra'anana local retired team of basketball players. We can grind them down and so on. We're not going to accomplish our objective either in Gaza or in Lebanon, and for that matter in Syria, neither in Syria, by military force alone. As a matter of fact, I think that the entire approach is flawed because the assumption that we can weaken Hezbollah sufficiently to the point that it will disarm voluntarily or otherwise, I think is a mistake, strategic mistake. I think the only way to get Hezbollah to disarm is if Lebanese are able to do so. Now, there is a logic in Israel for some reason. Let's put more pressure on the Lebanese government and the Lebanese army Both are far too weak to stand up to Hezbollah. Just to illustrate, the Hezbollah militant is paid 3 times as much as a Lebanese military soldier. I think what is called for is for Israel to take the initiative of creating an international consortium of all interested parties, from Saudi Arabia to France and the US, of course, in order to sit down with the Lebanese government and work out a plan whereby the international community provides Lebanon with the means to strengthen its government, to strengthen its military. Let's just use one illustration. In the wake of the 2006, the last war we had with them, it was Hezbollah that reconstructed housing and thus created loyalty to civilians in the south. How about if somebody would provide the Lebanese government with the means to do so and therefore acquire their loyalty and their allegiance? I think that in the wake of October 7th, the pendulum in Israel has swung to the other extreme. If previously we counted on deterrence and it failed because we misunderstood intentions, we moved to the other extreme that every threat is to be addressed by force. Yeah, force is essential, but limping on one leg of force without the other equally potent diplomacy leads us to exceptional military successes that do not produce lasting, stable environment.
Right. Though there are many challenges for a stable environment in this region, even out of Israel's control militarily or diplomatically. Finally, Jonathan, let's just, even if we're assuming that this may be the end of at least maybe the end of the sort of fighting portion of this conflict. Let's look at more of the lasting impact. What are the challenges now for Israel going forward, if indeed, for whatever reason or whatever comes out of the agreement with the U.S., basically this is the end of the military conflict against Iran? What does Israel have to do, especially, for example, dealing with its image in the world, something you have a lot of experience with in the if anyone who follows you on social media and mass media knows?
I think Israel has its work cut out, to say the least. And I think we find ourselves under this government, under this lack of strategic communications and effective diplomacy, in perhaps the most difficult and lowest point that we have ever been. And the mismatch between how well our troops, our Mossad agents, our pilots have been operating on the battlefield and defeating and striking enemies, and how ill-perceived Israel is in the world, in the West, mostly, is profound. It is very regrettable, and I think Israel needs to invest tremendous amounts of capital, talent, resources, and priorities in order to really work. And there are models out there of countries that prioritize soft power, that really invest in nurturing their positive image. And the absurd thing here is that Israel has so much positive to offer, and Israel is doing so many positive things in the world. We are contributing so many positive things in the world, yet the military confrontational aspect of Israel is almost the only thing that is visible in international media. Yes, that is also because international media, by and large, is biased against Israel. And yes, that is also because anti-Semitism is still a very strong and potent driver of public opinion. But I think Israel needs to really rethink. And I very much agree with Dr. Novik's point here about diplomacy and about the need here. We really need, I think sadly, we're going to suffer. We, the State of Israel, our institutions, our universities, our financial, our market, our exporters, our cultural aspects in Israel, we can find ourselves in a very difficult situation as a result of this war, which is absurd. But we need to really invest in order to turn that around and be seen and perceived for what we really are. A small country surrounded by enemies that is just fighting in order to defend itself, its sovereignty, and to live in its ancestral homeland. But there's so much more to be said in positive for Israel, which regretfully isn't being done by this government, and I wish that was different, and I hope that the Israeli public will recognize that as a super important topic. We're going to have elections in about half a year. I hope that will be part of the calculus of the elections. I don't think that it will, but I think that it's urgently needed, and I would hate to see the day where a different U.S. administration would turn a cold shoulder towards Israel, and we would find ourselves, unfortunately, reaping the sour seeds that this government has planted in terms of public diplomacy. But it's not too late to fix. There's a lot of talent in Israel. There's a lot of great people. We are doing great things on the ground, and there's so much more that can be said. And last thing, I just half a sentence. Let's not forget the Iranian people. There's a ceasefire now, but the Iranian people is the X factor that the regime hasn't, total control over, and that still needs to have a different reality. And I hope that the Iranian people will be given the tools and the capabilities to actually reclaim their freedom. And let's not forget how they started and the possible positive outcomes if the Iranian people is able to overthrow the regime.
Right, we're going to have more on that in a moment. But finally, Dr. Novick, Jonathan stressing the challenges. There are, which you could address, but there are some opportunities for Israel here too, perhaps regionally. Look at the Gulf states, countries like Saudi Arabia that reportedly were not happy with this, for example, wanted to continue the battle of Iran. There might be opportunities for Israel here.
You know, your question fits well with my take on what Jonathan just described, because I think that a good policy speaks louder than public diplomacy. I don't think that it is the Iran crisis, the war right now, that triggered the world isolation of Israel and finger pointing. I don't dismiss anti-Semitism as a driver, but when Israel behaves differently, anti-Semites hide in their holes and whisper their venom to themselves. And when Israel is perceived as a violent bully of the neighborhood, anti-Semites take to the microphone. I think that we're talking about 3 years of an Israeli policy that turned away the liberal democratic crowds in the West, in the U.S. included, all the way from the anti-democratic efforts of the government pre-October 7th, the fact that Israel continued the war in Gaza after the IDF already announced that Hamas military formations have been demolished, and now the blame, which I dispute vehemently, that Israel drags the U.S. into the Iran thing, as though President Trump has no agency and he doesn't make his own decisions. But nonetheless, we're talking about a situation where in the region as well, since we struck in September, we struck in Doha, Qatar, countries that were on the verge of moving forward with relations with us started to worry that this government in Israel is unhinged. And therefore, it will take a lot of work in the area that Jonathan spoke about and in the area that I speak about, a different policy, regional and local, including on the Palestinian issue, for the damage done thus far on the international arena to start moving in the other direction.
All right. Well, a lot of one thing for sure is we're moving into a post-war period that's going to be quite different, both regionally and we have to say it looks also globally as well. Jonathan Conricus, Dr. Nimrod Novick, thank you for joining us on ILTV.
Pleasure.
We just heard Jonathan say, let's not forget the Iranian people. They're, of course, the party here that is most impacted by all of these developments, including the ceasefire. And for more on that, we are joined by Maral Samasi. She is chair of the Zira Institute, and she herself comes from Iranian roots. She speaks to us from Europe. Maral, thank you for joining us. So let me ask you, what are you hearing, if you're hearing anything, because of the limitations, and what is your own thoughts, and also among the Iranian community diaspora, towards this ceasefire?
To Iran, there is a blackout. Yes, of course, the current situation is tragic, no question, but strategically unavoidable. There is no question about that. Military pressure without a clear objective, in other words, a half-hearted approach, would only make things worse. And this is the Iranian people are very clear about this. We support this war. We want this Islamic mafia gone. And it seems the current strategy seems to be the only viable path, at least in my view. We all know the Islamic Republic is not a normal state. It is an apocalyptic death cult with expansionist ambitions. And the remnants of this Islamic mafia still terrorizing Iran are certainly not a new government, as President Trump suggested in his recent tweet about a potential deal. My question would be, elected by whom? Given President Trump's track record of strategic ambiguity, it's exactly that, a strategic tweet, nothing more, in my view. We only need to look at the clear historical parallels. Regimes like Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan were tolerated for very long, far too long, and that hesitation cost millions of lives. Of course, strikes on infrastructure will also hurt Iranian civilians. That is the brutal reality. But all of this could have been avoided years ago had the world acted with responsibility and moral clarity. But as we know, it didn't. So we have to ask the more important question: what does it mean for the Iranian people and the world if this regime remains in power? After everything we have seen, after years of disastrous decisions like Obama's absurd JCPOA, does anyone still seriously believe there is a better alternative for us Iranians? I don't think so. It's also telling how limited the regime's actual support is right now. Neither China nor Russia has meaningfully intervened, and their proxies are busy licking their wounds. That alone should put the circulating narratives about the regime's supposed strength into perspective. But what I find particularly dangerous, I wanted to mention that too, is the reemergence of a failed old foreign policy mindset. I recently read, it was 2 or 3 days ago, I read an article by John Bolton in which he entertains the idea of engineering regime change by arming fragmented opposition groups inside Iran, exploiting ethnic tensions, so to speak. We have seen this before, and it has failed repeatedly with devastating consequences. Taliban, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, you name it, are the bitter outcome of that logic. So we Iranians hope that won't happen. Anyone who believes Iran, one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations, can be reorganized along ethnic fault lines, fundamentally misunderstands the country. Iran is not an artificial construct, and we care deeply about the sovereignty of our borders.
Right. Maral, let me just ask you then. Let's even take the assumption that the negotiations fail and the war should continue. The question that has been raised is whether simply using air power and sea power and even cyber attacks are going to be sufficient to get rid of, as you say, this Islamic mafia, or ultimately there's going to have to be, somebody's going to have to put boots on the ground, something that it seems that President Trump simply has made a red line and that he is not willing to do. Would that be, at what point could attacks on Iran from there be sufficient to weaken the regime, and embolden the populace to go out in the streets and risk their lives in taking open action against them?
Well, I think the next phase would be Israel taking over, but not in that sense, so to speak, not in the sense of boots on the ground. Well, there are already enough Israeli, I believe, Israeli forces or Israeli allies on the ground in Iran. So, well, this is my interpretation or my projection. I believe that the next phase is more about decapitation of this regime. It's about starting a fragmentation process. They have already decapitated most of the leadership. So it's about initiating friction within the IRGC, I suppose, and probably arming the Iranian people, not the opposition fractions, but the Iranian people themselves. So that would help, I think.
Right. I mean, one thing I do hear from, for example, talking about the diaspora Iranian community, that wants to see the regime overthrown, that more could be done with it. Why isn't there a government in exile? There seems to be disagreement about, for example, if Reza Pahlavi could be used as at the very least as a figurehead or as a transitional figure, and be officially recognized as such by governments, even including the Trump administration, which has kind of kept its distance from him. I mean, where do you fall on that issue?
I think it is very smart to keep distance for President Trump, because otherwise they could claim that he is a puppet, as they always do. So create this narrative, and attack his legitimacy. And on the other hand, he never claimed he never wanted to be the king, or he just wants to.
Well, no, he has.
He just wants to help the transition.
Right,
So,
he said that. He has said that, but
said
still,
that.
he could be
never
recognized.
claimed the throne,
right,
or anything like that. So, I think it comes down to elections. So let him do this. Most of the Iranians, we have seen the Iranians, millions of Iranians in the streets. We have seen the footage. They were chanting his name. They were chanting Javid Shah. Millions of people, they risked their lives. So why not? Why shouldn't he come, help the transition, and then we hold elections? We will have either, if the Iranian people want it, we will have a constitutional monarchy. If not, well, we will see.
Right. And what about support? I mean, part of another strategy going forward, short of boots on the ground or even military action, could be serious economic pressure on the regime. Unfortunately, there are talk about even lifting some of the sanctions and doing it. And we have seen countries, Europe, other countries still buying oil, obviously countries like China, but even India. And that, I mean, is there ways that public campaigns can be brought there in Europe, in parts, certainly parts of the other Asia, to really make a serious boycott, economic boycott on Iran, on the regime?
They must. That was the mistake they did, the Europeans, particularly the Europeans, over the last 4 decades. And there needs to be a change in foreign policy with this regime, because it's not a legitimate regime. They cannot keep legitimizing and throwing it a lifeline. So that is that. But I don't think President Trump means what he says. As I said, ambiguity is part of his strategy. And we will see. I don't think this regime will last until summer. The pressure is high. They have been weakened. Their proxies are gone or licking their wounds. Right now, it's really, it comes down to keeping the pressure high, precision kinetic campaigns, intensified covert operations. And this is what I see. This is the strategy right now. And probably limited ground insertion.
Right. Well, let's hope your wish to see this regime fall by the summer's end, that should be a prophecy that should come true. But of course, it's going to take more than wishful thinking and sincere hopes to bring an end to its terror. Maral Salmasi of the Zira Institute, thank you for joining us on ILTV.
Thank you very much.
Well, early in the broadcast, we did touch on the issue of the war against Hezbollah in Lebanon and the fact that it is continuing despite the ceasefire that was instituted yesterday. For more on that, we are joined by Reserves IDF Major Avraham Levine of the Alma Research and Education Center there in northern Israel. And first of all, I want to just get your reaction to the news of the ceasefire and to a subject we discussed earlier, the apparent contradiction between the fact that Israel and the U.S. and President Trump himself has said that ceasefire does not include the IDF's actions against Hezbollah, and Iran, with the backing apparently of the mediator Pakistan, is claiming that it does.
All right. So first of all, the congratulations of the war is over a little too early, at least on this part of the world.
That's for sure.
And that's true not only for IDF. We hear the Hezbollah official warning to their own people, do not return to South Lebanon, do not return to the Dakhia and Beirut. The war isn't over. So I'm not sure about Pakistan in the international arena, but Hezbollah and IDF definitely understand the situation. And like continuing your previous interview with Maral, the war isn't over. The proxies are still there. The threats haven't been eliminated. By the way, that's also true about Iran. Iran continued to shoot the ballistic missiles, mostly with the splitting head, the cluster bombs that are still a threat. They're still over our heads. Right. That hasn't been eliminated. We're working with the U.S. and playing along, obviously, but just to say that target wasn't reached. And definitely not in Lebanon, with Hezbollah still being very strong. We see the government even sort of walking a thin line with still calling Israel out on stop attacking. But on the other hand, they're not doing anything in the right direction to stop Hezbollah, and still have Hezbollah basically threatening Israel and threatening Lebanon in many ways, their own people, threatening civil war if anyone touches their weapons. So I don't see the end close on this front.
Right, I understand that, but it does raise the question of if this ceasefire should, even if this particular ceasefire doesn't include Lebanon, or at least that's how it was presented to the U.S., if there is some kind of agreement reached, you have to imagine it is going to increase international pressure on Israel to either to end or curtail, or at least set some kind of definite goal in order to end at least this phase of combat. I mean, do you think we did see Israel step up its attacks on areas that it previously had not hit in Beirut? But at what point does Israel have to at least say, this is where we're going to, and then we're going to at least have our own form of either ceasefire or some kind of talks or negotiations, say, with the Lebanese government?
So I completely agree with both things. Saying on one hand, we need a clear target. And I think everyone should know about this. Us as civilians in the North, we really appreciate what's the end game, what are we waiting for? And the international arena would appreciate the same announcement. What's the goal? What's the target? And I mean, I'm willing to leave my kids at home another day, another two. I'm willing not to go to work and stay in the shelter, but I want to know what's the end game. And I think that's something that Jonathan Conrico spoke about a little, a clear target that we could present to the world, present to ourselves. Why are we sacrificing what we're sacrificing would help immensely here in the north and on the perception war that Jonathan was speaking about. I also think that as opposed to the picture of what's happening in Iran, which is easy to stop, we just call off the attacks. Here in Lebanon, we have boots on the ground.
Right.
Which means it will take longer. Even if we reach a decision, it will take longer to stop, and we need to form a clear line. And if it's not the original line, it will require much more work and infrastructure, which makes this a much longer chapter than just stopping and cutting off and saying the war's over, we finished.
I mean, of course it would be good. I mean, how do you see the idea? I mean, there are those people, even some in the government, that said, well, we don't want to go back to the full occupation of southern Lebanon that we saw from the Lebanon war until the pullout in 2000. There needs to be some kind of forward IDF positions, flexible, maybe on that ridge line that the IDF or the chief of staff was talking about, until the point when finally Hezbollah lays down that arms. And that increases the risk of Israeli soldiers being killed in Lebanon, but may provide some measure of security for the civilians living just across the border in northern Israel.
Exactly. Although I don't see that line being the Litani River. I don't see us pushing back that far. It will be some kind of a compromise between the blue line, the original border from years ago, and the situation right now. It will be an improved 2024 situation, which won't stop the rocket firing, which we're seeing today. Hezbollah is still shooting. News says over 30. We counted 15 attacks of over 30 rockets into the northern arena of Israel. And I think that will continue even if we have this strip, this some kind of buffer, but it will eliminate the invasion threat. It will eliminate all direct fire. And that's something significant for us living here in the north.
Right, but how, okay, so you talk about living with the possibility, though, of continued rocket fire. We heard these reports of Prime Minister Netanyahu the other week telling the local council heads and mayors, I guess Kiryat Shmona particularly, that they should not encourage, they should discourage residents from leaving the north, as we did have during the period of the Gaza operation, during that entire period. I mean, at what point, though, do residents of the north have to say, okay, we understand the necessity of attacking Hezbollah, but it's unrealistic to expect us to continue to living within shelters, especially when, as of this morning, the rest of Israel, for example, is returning back to normal life, including children going to school.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Being here in the north, I live literally a half a kilometer, literally less than a half a kilometer from the border. And actually, some of my kids will be going back to school, and some of them will be staying home. The family is splitting up, basically, because some of the schools are in the more central area of Israel, and will be split up in that situation. And I think we have the patience, and we have the longevity to say, we don't have a problem with that. I'll tell you the big difference from 23 and 24. We have IDF between us and Hezbollah. And as long as we have that feeling, we can survive and live longer and stay in this situation as long as IDF is in front of us. And that's a red line that no one will break again. And I don't think IDF will allow a situation of moving completely back, because we see the necessity with our own eyes again and again. And I think the only thing that will really stop Hezbollah is the Lebanese government, not IDF. We're just creating the opportunity for Lebanon to make it easier for them. I'm not sure they're picking up on the opportunity, but we'll wait and see.
What is there something that more can be done to enable them to pick up on that opportunity, or is that simply a lost cause? You seem to suggest there is a hope that could happen. Under what conditions, under what further steps maybe for that to happen?
Well, for the first time in a very long time, we've heard more than one call for direct negotiations. That's a great breakthrough that never happened. Even when we were speaking about, if you remember, the gas situation, the maritime border, it was never direct. It was actually written in the paper. It was written, this is not a beginning of negotiations. This is not a beginning of a peace process. Here they are picking up a little bit, and they want direct talks. So there is an opportunity here. We have to keep on pushing. We have to keep on fighting Hezbollah while allowing Lebanon to stand up, take a big breath, and say, we'll take this part, you do your part, and maybe we'll be able to reach our targets.
Right. I just want to clarify for our viewers, you are talking about direct negotiations, of course, between Israel and the Lebanese government in Beirut, not between, of course.
Of course. Much appreciated. Yes.
Israel and Hezbollah, which is very unlikely. Do you see the chance? We have about 40 seconds left. Do you see a chance of that happening, both with the governments in Beirut and Jerusalem?
I think there is an option to do that. I hope actually it's happening under the table, and I hope we'll see it officially happening and see direct negotiations. I think that's definitely a goal of both sides.
All right. Well, of course, we do hope that the residents of the North get some of that peace. Again, I have to stress that we here in Israel, we are in the rest of Israel, are going back to our lives, but the residents of northern Israel are still having to live between air raid sirens and rocket attacks and spending way too much time in their shelters. Avram Levine there of the Alma Institute in northern Israel, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
And that is a wrap for this edition of ILTV on the Hour. We're broadcasting live from Israel in the heart of the Middle East. We're here every hour on the hour with the latest breaking developments. Stay with us throughout the day for our next edition of ILTV. We'll be here as events continue to unfold. You could scan the QR code there for all our apps. Until then, I'm Khaled Ben-David. Thank you for watching.
Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I am Steve Liebowitz, and coming up in today's newscast, Iranian intelligence chief killed as IDF and CENTCOM prepare for coordinated strikes on Iran energy. Pakistan floats a proposal for a ceasefire. The U.S. and Iran have yet to reply. And all 4 bodies have now been recovered from the building in Haifa that was hit by an Iranian missile. Israel confirms it's killed the chief of intelligence of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Majid Kadhimi. And it took place in an airstrike earlier today. Defense Minister Israel Katz says he was briefed on the operation during an assessment with the IDF. Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir said that Israel will continue targeting Iranian security figures. The IDF said it's carried out a fresh wave of airstrikes inside Tehran as Israel and the United States finalize joint plans and prepare for a possible major escalation should President Trump's ultimatum to Iran expire by tomorrow night without a deal.
Reports indicate that Israel and the United States have finalized a coordinated list of strategic targets inside Iran following a series of high-level discussions between IDF Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir and senior U.S. Central Command leadership.
The talks are said to have focused on aligning operations and defining roles should the ultimatum expire without compliance from Tehran, with Israeli officials now awaiting final authorization from Washington before any broader action is taken. Prime Minister Netanyahu has reportedly briefed the Security Cabinet amid reports that Israel continues to lobby for strikes on Iran's energy sector and national infrastructure, which officials believe could apply significant pressure on the Iranian regime. Security sources say Israel remains on high alert ahead of Trump's deadline, with preparations underway for a range of scenarios. Trump's ultimatum centers on Iran reopening the Strait of Hormuz, a key global energy route, with Israeli assessments warning that failure to reach a deal could trigger a broader and more intense phase of the conflict as decisions in Washington are finalized.
It's only a day before the expiration of President Donald Trump's newest ultimatum over the Strait of Hormuz, warning of major consequences if Tehran does not comply. And as the clock ticks down, the U.S. and Iran are reportedly weighing a Pakistani proposal for a ceasefire. ILTV's Mayan Hoffman is standing by outside the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem.
Thank you, Steve. Standing here outside the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, the message from Washington is clear. There is no longer just a warning, but a countdown. The demand is specific, time-bound, and tied to a concrete action, reopening the Strait of Hormuz. The key question now is whether Iran moves to de-escalate or whether this deadline becomes the trigger for direct U.S. strikes. For Israel and the wider region, the stakes are enormous, with military escalation on one side and fragile diplomacy on the other. Let's take a look at my report. U.S. President Donald Trump has extended his deadline for Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz by an additional 24 hours, now setting a new cutoff for Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. The ultimatum marks the third delay after an initial 5-day deadline was expanded to 10 days and then pushed back again as Washington continues to pressure Tehran to restore shipping through one of the world's most critical energy routes. The Strait of Hormuz carries a significant share of global oil and natural gas, and its disruption has already sent prices higher, raising concerns about wider economic fallout. Trump has warned that if Iran does not comply, the United States could carry out sweeping strikes on Iranian energy infrastructure, including power plants and bridges. At the same time, he has signaled that negotiations remain possible, pressing for a broader deal that would see Iran give up its uranium enrichment program, a demand Tehran has firmly rejected. Iranian officials have responded with sharp warnings of their own. Parliament Speaker Mohammad Baghir Ghalibaf said the region will burn if the United States escalates further, accusing Washington of driving the crisis. Iran's Revolutionary Guards also warned that the Strait of Hormuz will never return to its former state, signaling a potential long-term shift in the region's security dynamics. Behind the scenes, diplomatic efforts are ongoing. According to reports, U.S., Israeli, and regional mediators are exploring a possible 45-day ceasefire framework. Those sources say the chances of a deal remain slim and time is running out. At the same time, Pakistan has proposed a two-stage plan to Iran and the United States that could take effect as early as today, beginning with an immediate ceasefire and leading to a broader agreement that would reopen the Strait of Hormuz, a source told Reuters. As the clock ticks down, both sides appear to be holding their ground, leaving the next 24 hours critical in determining whether this crisis moves toward confrontation or a last-minute deal. And as with past U.S. ultimatums, the uncertainty may be part of the strategy. But this time, the consequences of miscalculation could be far more immediate. Back to you, Steve.
And thank you, Mayan. Well, this afternoon, central Israel came under fire as a cluster bomb warhead separated in the skies above Tel Aviv, causing a record 27 impact sites, including in Bnei Brak, Ramat Gan, Petach Tikva, and more. Extensive damage is being reported, but thankfully, as far as injuries go, only one man was lightly injured from the blast, and a 40-year-old woman was injured while running to take cover during the sirens. Meanwhile, 2 bodies have been recovered overnight from the rubble of the residential building in Haifa that was struck by an Iranian ballistic missile, and 2 others were recovered today. Rescue teams worked through the night using advanced technology, including cell phone tracking, to locate victims trapped under the debris of the 7-story building, which suffered a direct hit. An 82-year-old man was injured in the strike, and he remains in serious condition and has been taken into surgery, while 8 others were lightly wounded, including a baby. Emergency crews, including Homefront Command and specialized rescue units, remained at the scene, continuing to search for the missing until they were found. In Tel Aviv, authorities said one of the missiles was a cluster-type munition, prompting emergency teams to search multiple potential impact sites across the Tel Aviv metropolitan area. Magen David Adom evacuated the seriously injured woman to Beilinson Hospital, while rescue crews continue to assess damage at more than 15 impact sites reported in central Israel. The IDF is intensifying its campaign against Hezbollah. That's the word from IDF Chief Eyal Zamir, who declared all of South Lebanon up to the Litani is now a combat zone. ILTV's Devo Klein has the latest.
During a field assessment in southern Lebanon, Zamir said the IDF is carrying out widespread strikes, targeting Hezbollah operatives, command structure, weapons, and economic infrastructure. He added that all areas south of the Litani River have become, in his words, a, quote, combat zone, where Israeli forces and the Air Force are systematically targeting the terrorists. Zamir said the IDF will maintain a forward defensive line to protect northern communities and will continue operations until the area is cleared of threats. He also stressed that disarming Hezbollah remains a long-term strategic objective to be advanced through both military action and political efforts. The IDF says it has been intensifying operations against Hezbollah in Lebanon over the past 24 hours, targeting command centers and economic infrastructures across Beirut. The military says airstrikes hit Hezbollah headquarters in the capital's southern suburbs, used to plan attacks against Israeli forces and civilians. The IDF also struck fuel stations belonging to the Al-Amana company, described as a key financial arm of Hezbollah, used to generate millions of dollars and support the transport of weapons and operatives. The IDF says it has struck Hezbollah command centers and fuel stations as part of an effort to deepen damage to the terror group's infrastructure. On the ground, IDF forces continue expanding targeted operations in southern Lebanon. Troops from multiple divisions, including the 91st and 36th, have been conducting raids, eliminating operatives and destroying weapon stockpiles. Soldiers located large quantities of Hezbollah equipment, including rockets, RPGs, anti-tank missiles, and military gear, some of it found inside civilian structures such as schools. Reserve paratroop forces report killing several Hezbollah cells in close combat and directing airstrikes on additional targets.
And now joining us to discuss negotiations and war with the Islamic regime in Iran is Norman Rule, a retired senior U.S. intelligence officer who served in the CIA, focusing primarily on the Middle East and Iran, and is now a senior advisor at United Against the Nuclear Iran. Norman, good to see you again.
Good to be with you.
As you know, we have an alarm, potentially, but we'll try to see how far we can get. In Israel, we've been closely watching the Trump ultimatum to hit Iranian energy. If they don't capitulate to his demands, the expiration date, it's now moved a few times, and now it's moved an additional day. Is that to give diplomacy another 24 hours or to finalize military plans?
It's important that we look at three things happening at once here. We're watching a continuation of military activity by the United States and Israel. We're watching an increased intensity of the Trump administration's rhetoric, and we're watching an increased intensity of the diplomatic activity by Mr. Kushner, Mr. Witkoff. All three of these activities come together, and they're meant to give one last effort at diplomacy while the United States and Israel prepare for what will be a significant increase of military activity against Iranian infrastructure. We need to understand that once this activity takes place, Iran will likely respond against GCC infrastructure, and there will be consequences in the Gulf Cooperation Council and perhaps reflections in the world economy.
Well, Norman, there's a proposal out there now, brokered by Pakistan. It outlines a two-phase deal, including reopening the Strait of Hormuz, which was never really an issue at the beginning of the war, and follow-up talks to reach a broader agreement.
though Iran has not yet responded. Is this possibly going to be Trump's off-ramp?
It's possible, but Iran is going to push back on this. Iran is going to seek for two things. First, it's going to seek a permanent cessation of hostilities. And second, it's going to seek long-term control over the Strait of Hormuz, whereas the United States is seeking a temporary cessation of hostilities so that it can then push for a degradation permanently of Iran's nuclear program, its missile program, and its regional adventurism through the Quds Force. Iran doesn't want to go in that direction. So you've got two very different approaches to how this diplomacy wishes to end. Iran wants to leave this with permanent control of the Strait of Hormuz and retention of the Quds Force and retention of its missile program. So I'm not optimistic that diplomacy will succeed.
So diplomacy fails, and if the U.S. chooses the military option, what is the most likely course? Grabbing Karj Island, arming opposition groups to bring about regime change, airstrikes on key energy facilities, or all of the above?
Well, first, let's hope that diplomacy does succeed, because the intensity of pressure on Iran will increase in the coming 24 to 48 hours. But if it does move forward, we're going to see, based on the intelligence and the operational conditions at the time, an increase of military action against all of Iran's infrastructure, probably Iran's leadership. We've had reports that Israel killed the head of the Revolutionary Guard intelligence operations overnight. That will likely continue. And then we're likely to see pressure on perhaps Iran's islands, such as you've mentioned, and as the president has mentioned, Iran's energy architecture.
So let me ask you this. Folks in Israel are asking about the time frame of this conflict. What is your sense? How much longer are we going to be scurrying for shelter around the clock and have airports shut down and all of the other restrictions that are going on? What would be your guess for Israel?
Unfortunately, I think the conflict is going to go on for some time. The United States and Israel will need to devote additional time and resources to Iran's theater ballistic missile and drone activity, as well as the command and control behind these activities. And this is going to take at least several weeks, in my view. But it could be hastened if additional resources will be applied to that.
But do you see any possibility, for example, if there is a 45-day ceasefire like they're discussing now, how would you expect that period to go? Do you think Iran would stop firing at Israel if they stop firing at the U.S.? Will Hezbollah stop firing? Or are we basically stuck with the Houthis and Hezbollah, and maybe Iran will stop firing and maybe not?
There's been evidence recently that Iran, the Houthis, and Lebanese Hezbollah have coordinated operations. So it would appear that if the ceasefire does occur, and if Israeli operations against Hezbollah are also included in that ceasefire, which is, again, unlikely, that you might see a simultaneous ceasefire. But again, this is complicated. It would have to be nested within several different areas of operation, which makes it unlikely to occur all at once. But if Israel were to cease operations against Iran, Iran is likely to halt operations against Israel.
Norman, what is your sense within the U.S. administration? Are they tending towards wanting to continue until the job is done? Or are they looking for a deal, a very strong deal perhaps, a deal with Iran, and giving up on the idea of regime change unless it comes from within the Iranian people?
Well, I think you've said the same thing. A job that's done might well be constraining Iran and defanging it of its strategic missile program and leaving the Strait of Hormuz outside of its control. Israel and the United States have destroyed the architecture of its nuclear program, and ensuring that the architecture of oppression has been so severely damaged and degraded that the Iranian people, who have undertaken national unrest for a number of years, will likely do the same in the near term and then be able to successfully destroy what's left of the Islamic Republic in future uprisings. But again, that's up to the Iranian people to undertake, and not necessarily for the Trump administration to do.
We're once again facing a trip to the shelters. This time we'll conclude our interview. Thanks so much for being with us.
Be safe. God bless you all.
Step into the story of Israel's heartland with Blessed by Israel, where every purchase connects you to the land, the people, and the promise. Taste the sweetness of the promised land in their delicious honeys, or wear the story of the land close to your heart with the stunning Special Places of the Land necklace. Behind each product is a family, pioneers living in Judea and Samaria, crafting beauty and goodness from the soil of the Bible. When you buy their creations, you're not only receiving something extraordinary, you're investing in Israel's future, helping small businesses thrive and communities grow strong. Join a movement that celebrates faith, resilience, and hope. Visit blessedbyisrael.com and use ILTV's special code BLESSISRAEL, that's BLESSISRAEL, at checkout for 10% off on your first order. Be part of strengthening Israel, one purchase at a time.
More details have emerged on the high-risk U.S. rescue mission that took place deep inside Iran to recover the downed airmen. Reports describe a complex, multi-day operation involving special forces, intelligence support, and a plan that nearly unraveled during extraction.
The U.S. military carried out the coordinated rescue operation after an F-15 crew member was forced to eject over Iran, leaving him stranded in hostile territory. According to reports and overnight statements by President Trump, initial concerns were raised that the airmen may have been captured or even used as part of a decoy to lure rescue forces into a trap. Trump said authorities briefly suspected the distress signal itself could have been coerced. Those fears were dispelled after additional verification, including information from individuals who knew the airman, confirming he was alive and evading capture on his own. The airman is reported to have traveled through rough mountainous terrain, hiding in a remote location while using a distress beacon to help guide rescue forces to his position. U.S. Special Operations Forces, supported by aircraft and surveillance assets, were deployed as part of a planned extraction. Some reports indicate Israel provided limited assistance, primarily in the form of intelligence support, although details remain unclear. During the operation, rescue forces faced heavy risk as they approached the site, with reports of Iranian forces operating in the area and the possibility of engagement. Once the airman was located and reached, he was evacuated by helicopter to a forward airstrip. However, the mission encountered a major complication when evacuation aircraft became stuck in sand, delaying the extraction for hours and forcing the deployment of replacement planes. Ultimately, the airmen and rescue forces were successfully airlifted out of the area, and the U.S. later destroyed equipment left behind to prevent it from falling into enemy hands.
Here in Israel, when sirens sound, most people run to shelter, but some cannot. Children and adults with disabilities are often left behind, unable to reach safety as missiles fall. Their daily frameworks and routines have stopped. Therapies have been canceled. Hard-won progress is slipping away. Chimes Israel, a nonprofit that normally provides daily care and therapy in centers across the country, has shifted into emergency war mode. Their dedicated teams are going home to home under missile fire, doing whatever it takes to support each family. They are providing therapy, activity kits, and essential relief to families under constant strain. And they are working to build a protected shelter for preschool children in Modi'in. But they can't do it alone. Please scan the QR code to donate today to help protect Israel's most vulnerable. Well, Israel's High Court has ruled to raise the wartime limit on gatherings at the Western Wall and the Temple Mount from 50 to 100 people, as it seeks to balance security concerns with freedom of worship. The decision allows petitions filed by religious leaders who objected to restrictions imposed during the ongoing war with Iran, which has kept the holy sites largely empty during the Passover period. The court said it will continue to review the issue and asked security authorities to explain why a clear policy has not been established to allow religious activity under controlled conditions. The ruling comes amid political tensions over different treatment of public protests and religious gatherings, with officials across the spectrum weighing in on the balance between security restrictions and civil liberties during wartime.
So it's very sad. We used to come here every Jewish holiday with 50,000 people to be part of the Birkat Kohanim, blessing of the Kohanim. I'm a Kohen, so I'm one of the Kohanim who are blessing Am Israel, all the world basically. We blessing Am Israel for peace, for better days, for health, for everything. And we're coming here today, only 50 people, only 50 Kohanim who chose to come here to be a representative of thousands of Kohanim, wanted to come here to bless the world, but couldn't because of the situation, because of the war.
The Home Front Command is now giving Eilat residents an extended warning time of approximately 90 seconds to reach shelter, following an update to alert procedures and amid missile threats that are ongoing. The Israel Home Front Command says the adjustment is designed to provide additional time for residents to move to protected spaces when alerts are activated. Authorities continue to urge the public to follow instructions immediately upon receiving warnings and to remain close to designated shelters. Turning to the severe problems for air travelers. El Al has now canceled all scheduled flights until April 18th amid the ongoing war in the Middle East and government-imposed flight restrictions. The airline says an emergency flight schedule is in effect, with limited destinations including New York, Los Angeles, Miami, London, Paris, Rome, Athens, and Bangkok. And all passengers are required to rebook under current new tickets. And let's take a look at the weather forecast. Cloudy skies are expected around most of the country tonight, with temperatures reaching lows of 11 degrees Celsius or 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Then tomorrow we'll see rain showers in the morning and partly cloudy skies alongside steady temperatures, seeing highs of 18 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's a wrap for today's news. For the latest updates from Israel on all of your devices, be sure to follow our ILTV channels and keep up with us on social media. That's at ILTV Israel on all platforms. You can also catch us on Screen IL with 24/7 live coverage. Stay informed with the latest news straight from the heart of Israel. I'm Steve Leibowitz. Be well, and thanks so much for watching.
And today we once again have the pleasure of hearing from Yael Eckstein, president of the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, as she brings us the latest highlights and inspiring updates from the fellowship's ongoing work.
Shalom from here in Israel, and here are two fellowship projects that you should know about this week, and I'm actually telling you about them from inside of a bomb shelter. Number one, before the war with Iran broke out, the fellowship was preparing many projects to be able to respond immediately during times of crisis. One of the things that we prepared were thousands of emergency cards with money on them that we can distribute to people whose homes have been hit. People who have lost everything in the war and have nowhere to turn. In every single city in Israel that's in need, and especially those that are most affected by the war, the fellowship is on the ground helping the people. Number two, the fellowship recently went to go deliver food to elderly Holocaust survivors in Petah Tikva. And so the fellowship went to go deliver food to Nahum, the Holocaust survivor. And right before we went in, the siren sounded. We ran to the shelter. Immediately after, we went up to Nahum's apartment, and he was shaken, but thank God, alive. And what was so heartbreaking was when we were in the shelter, the only thing these elderly were asking for was, do you have my food? Because my cupboard is empty. There you have it. From here in a shelter, you now know about 2 more projects of the fellowship. Join me next week, same place, same time, for more updates on what's happening on the ground. Hello.
As Israel prepares for Passover, the holiday is unfolding under the shadow of war. Nearly 1.5 million people are living with food insecurity, as thousands of families are displaced and many still don't know where they'll sit down for Seder night. Since the war began, Leket Israel has distributed more than 2,000 tons of produce and tens of thousands of meals. Let's take a closer look.
Hi, it's Joseph Gittler, founder and chairman of Leket Israel. Today I'm in Kiryat Sharet, where a food distribution to those in need is about to happen. One of the Leket truck just showed up with an entirely full truck of a wide range of produce. We're now in the 4th week of the war. There are volunteers here helping out in order to do this distribution, which is going to happen very, very soon. I just spoke with the manager of this organization, and she told me she has extra demand this year. That is, of course, a repercussion of the ongoing war. We're 1 week before Pesach, nearly 4 weeks into the war. A lot of people have been laid off, unfortunately. A lot of businesses are suffering. And of course, those who suffer most are those in need. Prices, not surprisingly, because of the situation, have also started to creep up. So we're doing the best on our ability to provide as much fruits and vegetables and cooked meals and all other types of items to people in need for this Pesach.
I know Leket 70 years, and there is like a family for me and for all the people who take it, the vegetable and the fruit, and they do big things for the other people who need it. And we believe that if you give to somebody, the God give you back.
People talk about farm to table. What could be nicer than giving the needy this high quality stuff? This literally came from a farm in the last 24 hours, and now it's going to make its way to someone's Seder table. Today, we'll have about 300 families that will be coming to this site to pick up produce in order to make sure that their Seder table looks like so many of ours. Look at these onions. As good as you can buy in any store, the finest stores in the land will stock these onions. There's a bit of overproduction right now. Prices have dropped, and so farmers have been generous enough for the holiday to donate massive amounts of onions to Leket. And we are proud that we will distribute them to over 400,000 needy Israelis between now and the Passover holiday. We're making an extra push this year before Pesach because of the demand and because we want to give people respect when they come to their Seder table. But it's important to note, we don't view ourselves at Leket as an emergency food distribution organization. We're a food distribution organization every day of the year. But now, in a time of war, in a time of emergency, in a time of extra demand, we will do whatever it takes to make sure that those who count on us get what they need. So I hope those who see this can help out, come to our rescue, and make sure that no matter how long this war continues, we'll be able to do what we need to do.
Welcome to ILTV Security Brief. I'm Caleb Ben David. Each week, we focus on the latest developments in security and defense relating to Israel and the Middle East, impacting on this region and beyond. And we start with our top items of the past week. President Trump announces talks with Iran to end the war, suspends U.S. attacks on its energy infrastructure until Friday, and says the regime is desperate to make a deal. Iranian officials deny Trump's claims, say he is negotiating with himself, and they will only end the conflict on their terms. The IDF intensifies its strikes on Iran's military infrastructure, targeting missile launchers, weapon production sites, and regime operatives. The U.S. orders 2,000 paratroopers to the region for a possible ground operation if peace talks fail. Iran and Hezbollah continue to fire waves of missiles at Israel, with most intercepted by air defense systems. But some do get through, causing injuries and fatalities. Most recently, 27-year-old Nouriel Dubin killed in northern Israel from a rocket fired from South Lebanon. The IDF steps up its fire on Hezbollah operatives and infrastructure in South Lebanon and expands its ground operations there, blowing up bridges across the Litani River to prevent the movement of Hezbollah weapons and forces into the combat zone. And now our big story. President Trump's surprise announcement of constructive peace talks with the Iranian leadership may have been an exaggeration or wishful thinking, as with many of his public statements, but it was a clear sign that Trump is now at the stage of looking for an exit ramp to end the conflict, although not just on any terms. So the intransigent Iranian regime may not provide him with that out, and the war may go on, may even intensify. But Israel's leadership must now start seriously planning for a U.S. post-war arrangement that sees the regime seriously weakened but still in place. It must declare its own red lines for ending the IDF's offensive against Iran's military infrastructure and decide if and how to continue the war against Hezbollah while capitalizing on new diplomatic opportunities that may arise as a result of the geopolitical consequences of this conflict. First, here's some of what President Trump is saying.
If we can end this without more lives being down, without knocking out $10 billion electric plants that are brand new and the apple of their eye, I'd like to be able to do that, you know. But they can't have certain things. I mean, you know the things. I don't have to go over the list, but again, it starts with no nuclear weapons, and they've agreed to that. There won't be any nuclear weapons. They're not going to have, and they're not going to have enrichment, any of those things. But look, I hate to say that we're in a very good bargaining position, and I hate to say that they're defenseless because, you know, until that last missile is fired, they have little power. But we are in about the best bargaining position.
Well, joining us now is retired IDF Colonel Miri Eisen, now a senior fellow at the International Institute for Counterterrorism. Miri, thank you for joining us. President Trump, as usual, sounding optimistic. Clearly, he wants to have some kind of deal. A lot of skepticism here among Israeli officials. Do you share that? And what about perhaps the possibility we might even see a ceasefire during a negotiating period? Some people are even talking about maybe even a 60-day ceasefire.
One of the things we always forget is that with every military campaign, it does come to an end. And the question is on whose terms and at what stage. Right now, President Trump, I am putting aside the rhetoric. I'm sitting here as an Israeli. You and I both, Kalev, here in Israel in the last just few hours or last days. We go to our bomb shelter, we come home. We go to our safe room, we come home. We're very aware of what the Islamic regime still has. I don't think that there will be an endless war. This is going to end, and I think that we're already past the halfway stage, if I can call that. Will it end tomorrow morning? Will it be a ceasefire that will be like it's been in other places? A ceasefire doesn't mean that it's peace and everything stops. It means that you have some agreed parameters. Those are things which I think the United States is much more heavily involved in right now. In the meantime, Israel is continuing to attack all the different type of list of targets that you talked about before. So we're still on the go, and when we need to stop, we will know how to do so.
Right. Well, let's talk about that. Iran, of course, the regime is weakened. Of course, President Trump said that no nuclear weapons, no enrichment. There's this 15-point plan, but it's going to be negotiated. What should be Israel's red lines in order to end at least its offensive against Iran?
So there are two different things here. For the last 30 years, Israel has been at the forefront of the fact that Iran should never go nuclear. And I want to say happily, that is something that the entire world has understood and has stood up for. I think that the second thing is that Israel does not believe Iran, or I should say do not believe this Islamic regime, and we haven't believed them for the last 30 years. And at the end, sadly, we've been proven correct time and time again. The Islamic regime lies. It wants to build nuclear weapons. It's trying to build nuclear weapons. It's doing it in a variety of different ways. They've said in the past that they wouldn't enrich. They enriched. They've said in the past that they don't aspire to weapons. They aspire. So you have to go within the arena that we don't believe them. So you want to put in very clear type of limits where you are overlooking it. Remember that we have absolute air superiority right now over all of Iran. That is a huge military capability. And that means that if they don't abide by what needs to be done, no nuclear at all, then both the United States and Israel have that capacity to continue doing what they've been doing for the last 26 days.
Right. Now, of course, the nuclear issue is paramount, existential for Israel, but Israel has other concerns. Iran's conventional ballistic missile program, its support for its terror proxies. How insistent should Israel be that those be red lines if it faces the prospect, for example, of the Trump administration lifting sanctions, leaving the regime in place and lifting sanctions that will strengthen it in the long term?
Well, one of those things that comes up all of the time is what will that regime do? Will it yet again, like it did after June of last year, or even after November when Israel and Lebanon signed a ceasefire that had to do with Hezbollah, that main Iranian Islamic regime proxy? So I think that Israel right now is clearly diminishing and degrading the missile and drone capability in a variety of ways. It's going after the launchers. It's going after the launch sites. It's going after the arsenals of weapons. It's the places where they do the R&D to do a lot of new different types. And also Israel, both together and separately, Kalev, started a ground operation together with an air operation against the main proxy, Hezbollah. This, of course, after Hezbollah made a clear-cut choice on March 2nd to join in with the Islamic regime. I think for Israel, the main aspect will be that in any agreement now that the United States arrives with the Islamic regime, whoever there is doing that, because that's not directly Israel, the campaign that Israel is doing to diminish and degrade Hezbollah in Lebanon will be separate and will continue. That's on our northern border. As you mentioned before, we had a young woman, 27 years old, driving in a car, got out of the car because of the alert and was killed by a Hezbollah rocket. And when we're talking a Hezbollah rocket, that means an Iranian-made Hezbollah rocket.
Right. But of course, Mary, Israel came to a ceasefire agreement that was overseen by the U.S. Last year, where Hezbollah was supposed to be disarmed. Clearly, as you said, every day we see that Hezbollah has not been disarmed. Israel may come under similar pressure for another such agreement when the Iran war, if and when it ends. So how is it going to ensure that it doesn't come to another agreement that really will not have any substance to it?
There are real big changes that are happening inside Lebanon, and if there's one thing that gives me a positive outlook, it's the fact that in the last 26 days, Lebanese, and I'm not talking about the common Lebanese, I'm talking about the Lebanese president, prime minister, and foreign minister have openly said that the reason, the fault for everything happening in Lebanon right now is Hezbollah, not Israel. Israel has been very clear in targeting Hezbollah targets, both in the south and in Beirut and in the Bekaa Valley. This is not Israel against Lebanon. And when you talk about, so how do you ensure, maybe, perhaps, we want to hope, but you got to also help them a bit, if this new Lebanese government that is openly willing to outlaw Hezbollah, Kalev, they're willing to banish the Iranian ambassador from Lebanon. These are huge steps for the Lebanese government, and they're the ones that can perhaps be the ones that hand in hand, it's not an easy process, will disarm Hezbollah. So I really do think that that could be a major game changer. It definitely impacts Israel. It doesn't mean that Hezbollah won't have yet another missile to fire, but it means that they can be pushed aside within Lebanon. That's the best for us all.
Right. Mary, you mentioned how this conflict is being a game changer for Lebanon. But if we're looking at the region in the Middle East, not just Lebanon, I mean, we're seeing really major geopolitical shifts underway in the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, in terms of their military posture towards it, even in countries like Qatar and Oman. What are the opportunities that Israel perhaps could take advantage of, may have to, if it is going to have to restrain an Iranian regime that at the end of this war is weakened but still standing?
Let's say it's weakened and still standing. Let's look at the countries that are nearby. At the end, Israel is over 1,000 miles away from Iran. If we look at Qatar that you mentioned, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, or Saudi Arabia, let alone Oman, all of these countries right now have directly been attacked by this Islamic regime. They've been targeted by them. They've had ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones, different types of capabilities thrown at them over these last 25 days. This brings about an opportunity, and it's horrible that war does this, but it does. It's about a security coalition. It's about seeing together that this regime, you can't believe it, all of these countries for so many years cultivated a hand-in-hand relationship with Iran. They did nothing against Iran on February 28th, and yet this Islamic regime attacked them. And I think that there is the possibility here for, I don't call this isn't about, peace and everybody's happy, but about working together with all of these countries against a joint threat to make sure it's diminished, it's degraded, that Iran and that Islamic regime are not the ones defining the rules of the game in the Middle East.
And Mary, finally, I want to ask you, I mean, obviously, as we said before, even if the war would end today, the fact that the Iranian regime has been weakened, that is a huge gain or benefit for Israel. But is it too early to say potentially what are the lessons, both positive and less so, that Israel has learned, at least from this conflict so far?
I actually think that Israel's portion within this conflict, we've implemented lessons of the last 2.5 years. I don't think that we expected instant regime change. It's about enabling that possibility. What Israel has been doing prevent and preempt. When the Islamic regime openly calls for the annihilation of the State of Israel, the Zionist entity, we're not sitting around and waiting. We're going after the different capabilities that they built all of the years. It doesn't make me happy. It doesn't make it easy. But the idea is that terror organizations, terror regimes, terror entities don't get to define the rules of the game. I think these are lessons that we learned. We still need to implement more of them. But the strongest lesson for me, Kalev, is that we cannot only have our military prowess, and look at me with my fist right now, we also need to develop that important diplomatic muscle. It goes hand in hand. That's what could bring together a better future, a coalition, difference with Lebanon, let alone with all of the Gulf countries.
All right, and perhaps those opportunities will arise, and they can be utilized to secure Israel's future. Colonel Mary Eisen, thank you so much for joining us on ILTV Security Brief.
Thank you so much, Kalev.
Now, as the war approaches the 1-month mark, major questions arise over what is really going on now in Iran. Who is actually in charge there? How willing or not might they be to now make the compromises that are needed to end this war? And what is the current state of the Iranian people, especially in the face of a possible resolution that will still leave the Ayatollah's regime in place, weakened, but still in place? Well, let's take a listen to one Iranian response to President Trump's call for peace talks.
سطح خوددرگیری‌هایتان به مرحله مذاکره خودتان با خودتان رسیده؟ نه خبری از سرمایه‌گذاری‌هایتان در منطقه خواهد بود و نه قیمت سابق انرژی و نفت را خواهید دید تا وقتی که بفهمید ثبات در منطقه توسط دست قدرتمند نیروهای مسلح ما تضمین می‌شود. ثبات از طریق قدرت. صراحتاً اعلام می‌کنیم تا موعدی که اراده ما نباشد هیچ وضعیتی به روال سابق برنمیگردد. این اراده زمانی ایجاد می‌شود که به طور کامل فکر اقدام علیه ملت ایران از اذهان کثیف شما پاک شود.
Well, joining us now is Mitra Jashny. She is a political and cultural expert on Iran and an advisor at the Iranian Americans for Liberty organization. Mitra, thank you so much for joining us. You heard from that military spokesperson for the Iranian army, just outright defiance. But of course, it does beg the question, as I said, who is really in charge of Iran? And maybe more important than which individuals are, what is really their state of mind at this moment? What's your best estimate?
Thank you very much for having me in your show. That's an honor to talk with the people of Iran and also people of Israel and Americans via this show. In reality, we are dealing with two layers of power in Iran. The first, in the official narrative presented through state media, an attempt to portray a centralized leadership increasingly around Mojtaba Khamenei, as everybody knows. But the second layer in the actual power structure, and here serious question arises, where is this leader? How can a country that is currently at war have a figure who is not publicly visible? And more importantly, is he truly the chosen leader of the system, or is this the constructed image designed to mask where power really lies? What we are seeing suggests the latter. Mojtaba Khamenei appears less as an independent decision maker and more as a symbol within a broader power. The real power today lies with the IRGC because they control the military force, they effectively control the state. And this influence extends across the entire political structure, from the so-called elected president to other key figures, and operating within a system ultimately shaped and constrained by the IRGC. So this is not about a single leader. It is about a military-dominated power structure that defines decision-making in Iran today.
Right, but is this a structure that can perhaps make some of the kind of compromises that President Trump believes is necessary for a peace deal?
First, it is very difficult to determine whether President Trump's statements about contacts or negotiations with the figures inside the Islamic Republic, especially at the highest levels, reflect actual engagement or whether they are part of the broader strategic efforts to influence internal dynamics. That said, one principle remains clear. Leaders act based on the interests of their own nations. It is therefore understandable that both President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu would pursue any strategy they believe serves their national interests. However, there is a critical distinction that must be made. Negotiating with the Islamic Republic may at best function as a temporary bondage, but it does not address the underlying problem. From both lived experience and long-term observation, I do not see credible evidence that this system is capable of meaningful or structural change. And this is not only about its internal governance, it is even more evident in its external behavior. The Islamic Republic has consistently demonstrated patterns of regional destabilizations, ideological rigidity, and the use of violence as a tool of policy. So while it may offer limited concession in the short term to preserve itself, it is difficult to view it as a reliable actor that will uphold long-term commitments, whether with the United States, Israel, or any other country. As I mentioned earlier, the regime may be prepared to offer certain concessions, particularly in the short term, if doing so help ensure its survival. Any such negotiations would most likely take place with the United States, not with Israel, as your previous guest mentioned, as the Islamic Republic does not recognize Israel's legitimacy and does not engage with it directly. However, even if an agreement is reached, it is likely to be temporary in nature, and at present, we have not seen a decisive shift that fundamentally weakens the regime.
So let me ask you, if the military operation were to continue in some way, even expand, is there any prospect for regime change? Any point at which the regime would be so weakened that the Iranian public would feel secure enough to again either take to the streets or challenge the regime without risking their lives?
We hope that actually this is very difficult to reach inside Iran right now, because as you know, we don't have any access to internet. The people even can't talk with their family. They just call us in a few minutes, and after 2 or 3 minutes is going to be cut the phone. But as we see, we continue to see threats such as the potential closure of the Strait Hormuz alongside ongoing regional activities that contribute to the instability. But if I want to talk about inside the Iran, but I can say you something honestly and clearly. If a deal is reached that leaves the Islamic Republic in power, I believe this would be one of the most disappointing outcomes from the Iranian people. It is essential to make a clear distinction. The people of Iran are not the regime. They have been among its primary victims for decades, and they really hope something change. No nation welcomes war. No society wants to see its cities damaged or its infrastructure destroyed. This is especially true for Iranians who have already endured years of economic hardship, much of it driven by the regime's own policies and decisions, of course. At the same time, many are still grieving recent losses, and yet, despite all of this, some have accepted the risk of this war because they hope it might lead to real and meaningful change. If that hope is not realized, then once again, it is the Iranian people who will bear the cost. What we are already witnessing in deeply concerning increased internal repression threats against activists even outside Iran, and growing pressure on families and relatives inside the country. So in such a scenario, the consequences will not limit it to politics. They will be human, societal, and deeply personal for millions of Iranians.
All right. Well, we wish the best, of course, as always, for the Iranian people. Mitra Jashny, thank you so much for joining us on ILTV Security Brief. And now a final word. In the first 2 months of 1999, Saddam Hussein's Iraq fired over 40 Scud missiles into Israel, damaging thousands of homes in the center of the country, wounding dozens, and killing 2 residents of Ramat Gan. Like most Israelis during that period, I huddled in a regular room in my apartment, sealing the door and windows with towels and tape in anticipation of a chemical weapon attack that never came and never was going to come. What I didn't have then, like so many other Israelis, was a protected room in my apartment or quick access to a shelter. That was 35 years ago. Lucky for me, my current home does have a shelter in our building. But many are not so fortunate. A report issued by the State Controller's Office in January found that over 3 million Israelis still live without the benefit of a protected room in their homes or quick access to a shelter. The problem is especially acute among the Arab and Bedouin communities. But as the last month has shown, there's no shortage of this particular shortage in many other places and sectors of the country. The lack of proper shelters is a problem that residents of the Gaza border area in the south, the Lebanon border area in the north, who have both borne the brunt of enemy air attacks for decades, have long sounded the alarm over. And the 12-day war with Iran last June was a belated wake-up call for the rest of the country. Of course, the situation could be much worse. Some 6 million Israelis do have access to shelters, even if some are still negligent in following home front commands to promptly seek cover in them, leading to some tragic incidents. And Israel's array of air defense systems, such as the Arrow and Iron Dome, even if not 100% effective, have undoubtedly saved thousands of lives from the waves of Iranian and Hezbollah missile attacks. But there is no reason that a country which spent billions and invested immense efforts in developing those remarkable security devices could not even more easily have met the challenge of providing the low-tech and lower-cost security solution of adequate shelters and protected rooms for the millions of Israelis still lacking them. The fault is a lack of proper planning by local authorities, misplaced budgetary priorities by national governments, and perhaps a general sense of complacency that the day would come when Israel would find itself under this threat of continuous air attacks for this period of time. But Saddam's Scuds 35 years ago should have been sufficient warning. And now the government must ensure as quickly as possible that if and when the next war comes, millions of Israelis won't again find themselves without a proper protected roof over their heads. Thank you for joining ILTV Security Brief.
Well, the Knesset approved a law allowing the death penalty for convicted terrorists with blood on their hands, passing the measure by a vote of 62 to 48 with one abstention, following a push by National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir and his Otzma Yehudit party. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also backed the legislation. The passage of the law does signal a major policy shift and is expected to draw close legal scrutiny as well as international attention in the days ahead. ILTV's Kalev Ben-David has more.
The vote for the death penalty followed a lengthy political and legal debate, with coalition support securing final passage. During the session, National Security Minister Ben-Gvir marked the occasion in the plenum, calling the bill a significant and historic step.
בעד חוק עונש מוות, 62, 48 מתנגדים, נמנע אחד. אני קובעת כי הצעת חוק עונש מוות למחבלים, תשפ"ו 2026, התקבלה בקריאה השנייה והשלישית, והחוק ייכנס לספר החוקים של מדינת ישראל. שהחיינו וקיימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה. עם ישראל חי!
Under the new law, the death penalty would apply in certain future cases of terrorism, particularly where nationalist motive is established. Supporters argue it will serve as a deterrent against future attacks. Israel already has a death penalty provision under military law, but it has been used only once in the country's history. In 1962, when Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann was executed by hanging after his conviction for crimes against humanity. Opposition leaders warned that the legislation faced legal challenges and international backlash. They criticized the bill as political and argued it would not apply to anyone in custody, including Hamas Nukba terrorists who invaded Israel on October 7, 2023. But Minister Ben-Gvir defended the bill as a necessary deterrent measure.
מהיום ידע כל מחבל וידע העולם כולו, מי שנוטל חיים, מדינת ישראל תיטול את חייו. הצדק הזה צריך להיראות ולהיעשות, וממחר בבוקר בעזרת השם יתברך הוא יעשה.
It remains to be seen whether the death penalty law will ever result in an execution or even remain on the books after court challenges. Welcome back to ILTV on the Hour. I'm Khaled Ben David, coming to you live from Israel, bringing you all of the biggest headlines from across the region. Let's take a look at the latest developments. It is now day 2 of the 2-week ceasefire declared between the U.S. and Iran. Overnight, President Donald Trump renewed his threat to use unprecedented force against Iran if it does not comply with the terms of the ceasefire. Trump posted all U.S. ships, aircraft, and military personnel with additional ammunition, weaponry, and anything else that is appropriate and necessary for the lethal prosecution and destruction of an already substantially degraded enemy will remain in place in and around Iran until such time as the real agreement reached is fully complied with. But Trump is facing a new diplomatic test as he prepares for high-stakes talks with Iran this weekend, just one day after announcing a fragile ceasefire already showing signs of strain. According to a White House official, Vice President J.D. Vance will lead a U.S. delegation to Islamabad, Pakistan on Saturday for direct talks with Iranian officials. Vance will be joined by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and President Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner. The talks will take place under a 2-week clock established by the ceasefire agreement, with the Trump administration hoping to turn the temporary halt in fighting into a broader, lasting agreement. Officials in Jerusalem are concerned the ceasefire does not resolve the core issues that led to the war, including Iran's nuclear program, ballistic missiles, and support for terror proxies. Lead U.S. negotiator Vice President Vance says a deal is possible if Iran acts in good faith, but warns that Washington retains significant leverage if negotiations fail or are undermined.
The president did is he basically issued an ultimatum to the Iranians. He said, open up the straits, stop trying to hold the world's economy hostage, and we'll engage in a ceasefire. And that's exactly the agreement that we came to last night. The Iranians have agreed to open up the straits. The United States has agreed to stop attacking. And that, and not just the United States, but also our allies, have agreed to stop attacking. And that is the basis of this fragile truce that we have, which is now, 8 to 12 hours old.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is publicly backing the announced 2-week ceasefire and has committed to halting airstrikes on Iran. But Netanyahu is referring to the agreement as a temporary suspension of fighting. The Prime Minister's office stated that Israel supports President Trump's decision to suspend strikes against Iran for 2 weeks, subject to Iran immediately opening the Straits of Hormuz and stopping all attacks on the U.S., Israel, and other countries in the region. Now, the Israeli Air Force has not carried out any strikes in Iran since around 3 a.m. yesterday, following a final wave just hours before the ceasefire took effect. Last night, Netanyahu addressed the nation to sum up Roaring Lion up until the suspension of fighting.
יש לנו עוד יעדים להשלים, ואנחנו נשיג אותם, או בהסכמה, או בחידוש הלחימה. כי אנחנו ערוכים לחזור ללחימה בכל רגע שידרש. האצבע על ההדק. עכשיו אני עמדתי על כך שהפסקת האש הזמנית עם איראן לא תכלול את חיזבאללה, ואנחנו ממשיכים להכות בו בעוצמה.
And as we heard there from Netanyahu, Israel is insisting the 2-week ceasefire announced by the U.S. does not apply to the war against Hezbollah in Lebanon. President Trump called that conflict a separate skirmish, making clear that Lebanon was not part of the Iran ceasefire deal. Yesterday, the Israeli Air Force says it carried out its largest waves of airstrikes against Hezbollah since the start of the fighting, targeting around 100 sites. According to the IDF, the strikes hit locations in Beirut, the Bekaa Valley, and South Lebanon, including command centers, intelligence headquarters, and other military infrastructure. Now, as that battle goes on, an Israeli soldier was killed and 5 others were wounded during a clash with terrorists in South Lebanon. The slain soldier is named as Staff Sergeant Tuval Yosef Lifshitz, 20 of the Golani Brigade. May his memory be a blessing. And that ends this update on ILTV News. Of course, continue to follow us for all the latest updates, or you could check out our app. There's a QR code on your screen. I'm Kalev Ben-David for ILTV. Thank you for watching.
Welcome back to Axis of Truth. We're back in the studio as the U.S.-Israel war against the Islamic Republic enters its next phase. A new narrative is being pushed hard across Washington. The media and social media are now saying that this war is out of control. The United States and Israel are already somehow losing this war. So let's talk about it. What we're watching unfold this week isn't just a war, it's a coordinated effort to redefine that war in real time. And if you're only following Western headlines or commentary, you'd think that everything is spiraling, that the United States and Israel have lost control and the campaign is already veering off course. But that's simply not what the facts show. And the gap between perception and reality right now isn't accidental, it's being actively constructed. Start with the most basic point that somehow the entire media class has decided to ignore, which is that this war has only been going on for a matter of weeks. And as you already have commentators acting as if the absence of total immediate collapse means something is wrong, as if complex military objectives that involve dismantling nuclear infrastructure, degrading missile systems, and hitting regime networks across multiple domains are supposed to be completed instantly. Well, that's not how war works. It's like the Western media has completely lost any concept of how wars operate today. They have no sense of timelines, no understanding of sequencing, and no patience for operations that are designed to unfold in phases. The expectation seems to be that if everything is not immediately resolved, then something must be wrong. Something must have failed, which isn't really analysis when it comes to war, it's ignorance. Now look at what the United States is actually saying about the campaign, because that matters a lot more than the media hysteria that we're hearing and seeing on social media. Senior officials have made clear that the objectives are defined and that progress is being made within that framework, and that those objectives, they're not vague or open-ended, they are specific and measurable. The objective here is to destroy the nuclear program and its ability to rebuild it, to debilitate the ballistic missile program and its ability to rebuild, to cripple the regime's ability to finance and support terror proxies in the region, and to take out key regime infrastructure to allow the people a chance to rise up. All of those are on track. That is what is actually happening on the ground through sustained and targeted strikes on missile production sites, drone facilities, naval assets, IRGC-linked infrastructure, and command and control systems that the regime depends on to operate both internally and across the region. When you look at that whole operational picture, what you see is a methodical campaign degrading capacity layer by layer, not a chaotic situation that's spinning out of control. Now compare that reality to what's being pushed in the media. You have Piers Morgan telling Trump to get out of the war as soon as possible, as if abandoning the campaign midstream somehow produces stability. You have people like Megyn Kelly trying to shift blame onto Israel, pushing the idea that the United States is somehow being influenced rather than acting in its own interest.
No one should have to die for a foreign country. I don't think those 4 service members died for the United States. I think they died for Iran or for Israel.
And then you have Axios, the champion of fake news this entire war, publishing a report highlighting that J.D. Vance expressed skepticism about Israeli pre-war assessments, which was immediately twisted by Axios into a claim that the United States was misled or dragged into this. And the evidence, of course, is that Iranians haven't risen up yet. Well, that argument collapses instantly when you look at what has actually happened, because the Iranian people were told explicitly not to rise up yet. They were literally told the opposite. Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi said it, Prime Minister Netanyahu said it, and President Trump said it. In fact, just a few days ago, CENTCOM Commander Brad Cooper reinforced this, making clear that the timing of any internal uprising would be part of a broader strategic sequence in the eyes of the U.S. Take a look.
My main message is this. First and foremost, we are attacking the regime in the Islamic Republic, not the wonderful people. The second piece is continue to heed our advice. We've had multiple messages that have come out that have said, beware, the government doesn't care about you. They're launching missiles and drones from occupied areas. You need to stay inside for right now. Third, there will be a clear signal at some point, as the president has indicated, for you to be able to come out.
Exactly. Now, this is super crucial because it shows that what we're seeing inside Iran right now isn't hesitation and certainly not failure. It's discipline within a coordinated approach where pressure is applied externally first, the regime is weakened structurally, and only then does space open up for internal action. Will it be enough? We don't know yet, but that is the plan for what's moving forward. It also exposes an ongoing psyop to manipulate the American public that's being led by people like Joe Kent, about whom I ask again, like I did last week, who is paying him? Anyway, when critics say, why aren't they rising up, they're ignoring the fact that the people they're referring to were explicitly told to wait, and that wait is part of the plan. Now, to move on to the next manufactured panic, which is the constant fixation on ground troops inside of Iran. Every few hours, there seems to be a new wave of commentary suggesting that this is heading towards Iraq and that an invasion is imminent and that this is turning into some kind of plan for a long-term occupation, a forever war. But that entire line of argument is built on either a misunderstanding or, in many cases, a deliberate distortion of the facts. Yes, there are discussions right now about special operations forces and limited ground elements that should not surprise anyone, quite frankly. Those discussions are tied to very specific, high-value objectives, including securing critical sites like Kharg Island, which is central to global energy flows, or potentially moving to secure or remove that highly enriched uranium, the 400 kilograms, to prevent escalation or proliferation by the Islamic Republic. Now, both of those are targeted, time-bound missions tied to strategic necessities for the United States. To lump that together with what happened with Iraq is honestly just lazy analysis. Iraq involved a full-scale invasion, a prolonged occupation, and an attempt to rebuild an entire political system over the course of several years. What's being discussed here are limited operations tied to clearly defined objectives with no indication of long-term occupation or governance. Not to mention the fact that Iran is not anything like Iraq. They have a completely different history. They're a different people. And unlike Iraq, Iran has a history of being a Western-friendly, high-functioning, and progressive nation in the global community. Perhaps most importantly, the Iranian people are the ones that are spearheading all of this initiative. It isn't an intervention from abroad with an excuse that, someone invented in order to take out specific leaders. And yet that distinction is being consistently erased because Iraq is an easy word to throw around if the goal is to shut down debate rather than to engage with facts and the reality on the ground in a complex situation. At the same time, Israel's position has been consistent to the point that it's almost ignored. Israel has repeatedly said that regime change in Iran is up to the Iranian people. That has not changed, and it's not new. And no amount of accusations from people like Joe Kent is going to change that reality. The goal of this war is to weaken the regime to the point where it cannot continue to operate as a regional and global threat, and to create the conditions where internal change becomes possible. That is the framework. Now step back and look at what's actually driving this reaction, because it goes deeper than simple disagreement. You have disinformation, and then you have privilege on the other side. First, the disinformation is the constant recycling of bad comparisons and misleading narratives, whether it's Iraq, whether it's claims that the U.S. was dragged into this by Israel, or whether it's the idea that timelines measured in weeks somehow indicates failure or a quagmire. And then you have privilege, particularly in the United States, where generations have grown up without experiencing war in any meaningful way, without understanding the need for deterrence, and without having to think about what happens when hostile regimes are allowed to operate unchecked.
And so the reaction is often ill-informed and emotional. But that perspective completely ignores the alternative, which is allowing a regime that has spent decades building proxy terror networks, targeting Americans, destabilizing entire regions of the world, and expanding its influence to continue operating without meaningful constraint. We're already seeing what that looks like, with activity across multiple fronts tied back to the same regime infrastructure that this campaign is targeting. So the idea that doing nothing reduces risk is completely disconnected from reality. A lack of deterrence invites expansion, and that expansion doesn't stay contained to Iranian territory or even the Middle East. So when you strip away the noise, the headlines, and the attempts to redefine this war in real time, what you're left with is a campaign that is progressing on course with its objectives, degrading the regime's capabilities across multiple domains, and doing exactly what it was designed to do within a timeline that, again, is measured in weeks. In other words, the U.S. and Israel are kicking ass in all the right ways, and the American public and media should be shutting up, quite frankly, and saying thank you, not inventing stories about how we're losing when we aren't. And now on to Lebanon. This next story is a perfect example of how quickly the narrative can harden before the facts are even processed, and why it actually matters to slow down and walk through what happened instead of reacting to a single loaded word. Now, this past week, we saw an Israeli airstrike in southern Lebanon that killed two individuals, Ali Shuaib and Fatima Fatouni. And within minutes, the framing across large parts of the media ecosystem was set. Israel has targeted journalists. Now, that framing spread fast because it's emotionally powerful and it's also legally loaded. And once that takes hold, it becomes very difficult to dislodge even when the additional facts come out. So let's start with what is actually known. Ali Shuaib is a longtime figure at Hezbollah's Al-Manar network. Now, Al-Manar is not a neutral media outlet. It's actually been designated by the United States as a specially designated terrorist entity, part of Hezbollah's infrastructure formally, and functions as a propaganda and operational arm of that U.S.-designated terrorist organization. Now, that designation isn't symbolic. It reflects years of evidence that the network has been used for recruitment, for messaging, and for support of Hezbollah's activities. Now, according to the IDF, Shoaib was not simply affiliated with the network in a media capacity. He was also an intelligence operative within Hezbollah's elite Radwan force. He was operating under the guise of a journalist with Al-Manar. Now, the Radwan force isn't a political wing or a media entity. It's a specialized unit within Hezbollah that's tasked with offensive operations, including cross-border activity and high-risk missions. Now, it matters because under international humanitarian law, the protection afforded to civilians, including journalists, isn't determined by job title. It's determined by status and conduct. Members of organized armed groups are considered combatants or continuous combat function participants, the exact terminology, which means they don't benefit from civilian immunity, regardless of whether they also perform media roles. Now, legal analysts who have looked at this kind of case consistently point to that standard that once an individual is integrated into an armed group and contributes to it in its military capacity, the presumption of civilian protection no longer applies under international law. Now, even beyond formal membership, the law is also clear that direct participation in hostilities removes civilian protection for the duration of that participation. That includes intelligence gathering, surveillance, transmitting information that has military value, or coordinating with fighters. And they're not abstract concepts. These are specifically addressed in the International Committee of the Red Cross guidance and the widely accepted interpretations of the laws of armed conflict. So when the IDF states that Shuaib was functioning as an intelligence operative under journalistic cover, the legal analysis must necessarily shift immediately, because the relevant question, is no longer whether he held the title of journalist or where he happened to work. It's whether he was part of an armed group or contributing to its military operations. And if that threshold is indeed met, he's not a protected civilian. And this is exactly the point that many legal commentators and analysts who support the strike have emphasized, that the law does not protect individuals who are actively embedded within armed groups carrying out operations simply because they also engage in media activity. So failing to recognize that distinction creates a loophole that armed organizations can actually exploit. And they do, as we've seen with multiple terror groups. Now, the second individual, Fatima Fatoumi, was affiliated with Al-Mayadeen, which is also widely known as a pro-Hezbollah, pro-Islamic regime outlet that consistently amplifies the narratives of those actors. The legal case around her is less clear in terms of direct operational involvement, and that distinction should be acknowledged because, of course, not every person working within a politically aligned or even propagandistic media environment automatically loses civilian protection. But what is striking is how quickly the entire story was flattened into a single category, as if both individuals must be treated the same, and as if the label of journalist resolves the legal question without any further inquiry into the role, affiliation, or the activity. And that's just not how the law works. And it also, anything that we've seen hasn't proven that Israel targeted Fatima specifically because she was a journalist, contrary to what many people have accused Israel of. So when it comes to analyzing events like this, it's not serious what we're seeing in the mainstream media. And what many of the legal experts have pointed out in similar cases is that the abuse of these protected categories is a known tactic by multiple arms groups precisely because it complicates targeting decisions. It creates reputational consequences when strikes occur, especially in the event of Israel. And of course, we see that embedding operatives within civilian or quasi-civilian roles, including media, isn't incidental. It is strategic for groups like Hezbollah because it leverages those protections while simultaneously undermining them. And that's why I want to be very clear also on a personal level, because as a journalist, it's especially infuriating because these deliberate blurring of these lines, it doesn't just distort the story, it actively endangers people like me who are doing their job in good faith. I mean, real journalists who go into war zones without weapons, without protection beyond the law itself, relying on the understanding that they are civilians and that their role here is to document, not to participate. But when we see armed groups that are using journalism as cover, when operatives like Ali Shuaib present themselves as media while engaging in intelligence or military activity, they erode that distinction, and it actually makes every legitimate journalist more vulnerable in those areas. Because the next time someone's holding a camera, then we have to ask the question, are they documenting or are they operating? And that ambiguity risks lives in war zones. It also is made worse when media organizations refuse to acknowledge the difference and instead reinforce the idea that anybody who happens to have a press affiliation is automatically a protected civilian, regardless of what they're actually doing. Now, to look at the reaction to this strike. I mean, you saw immediate outrage framed around press freedom, around the supposed targeting of journalists, as I mentioned, and around the idea that this represents a violation of international norms. But much of that outrage is built on an incomplete or deliberately simplified understanding of who those individuals were and how the law applies to them. Because if one of the individuals was, as reported, a Hezbollah Radwan force operative operating under journalistic cover, then the legal framework doesn't treat him as a civilian, and the strike can't be assessed on the basis of journalistic protections alone. And by the way, here he is in a Radwan uniform. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that every strike is automatically justified on the flip side. It doesn't remove the need for proportionality or verification under the laws of armed conflict, but it does fundamentally change the category of the target, and that part is not being told in the media. So what you're seeing here isn't just disagreement about a single incident, it's a broader failure or refusal in some cases to engage with the actual legal standards that govern armed conflict. And that, combined with a media environment that prioritizes framing over accuracy and precision. In a war where information is contested as territory, that distinction really can make the difference in the public's understanding, because when you lose the ability to accurately describe who's a civilian and who's a combatant, you lose the ability to have a meaningful conversation about anything that follows, which is exactly what we see happening in the media right now, as well as, of course, the social media. And with that, let's finish things strong with the good, the bad, and the ugly. Kicking things off with the ugly, and this is where the mask really comes off, because after everything that we just discussed, the media manipulation and the blurring of those lines, deliberate misuse of language, this week you saw something that cuts through all of that and exposes what this system actually is. There are credible reports and footage showing that Islamic Republic-backed militias are moving from Iraq into Iran itself to support the regime. And that isn't a small detail or a side development. It's a fundamental shift that tells you exactly where things stand right now. We're not talking about influence or funding or coordination from a distance. We're talking about foreign fighters physically crossing into Iran to reinforce the regime at a moment of pressure. And that only happens when a government no longer has confidence in its own ability to maintain control on its own. What it reveals is a regime that's increasingly reliant on external force to sustain itself internally, and that completely shatters one of the core narratives that it's pushing now and has been trying to push for decades, which is that it stands against foreign interference and defends Iranian sovereignty. For over 40 years, the regime has done the exact opposite across the region, building Hezbollah in Lebanon, embedding militias in Iraq, propping up Assad in Syria before, backing the Houthis in Yemen, creating an entire transnational network designed to interfere in other countries and project power beyond, or rather terror, beyond its borders. That was always the reality, but now it's turning inward in a way that should be impossible to ignore. Because when that same network is redirected into Iran, when these Iraqi militias are being brought in to support the regime, you're not just looking at a government that doesn't represent its people, you're looking at a system that's actively choosing to rely on foreign actors over its own population in order to save their own necks. From the perspective of an Iranian citizen, it's a total betrayal because it means your government doesn't trust you, doesn't rely on you, and is prepared to bring in outside terrorists to maintain control by force. And we already know what these militias are capable of because they've spent years operating across the region with brutality, targeting civilians, attacking U.S. forces, destabilizing government, and enforcing the regime's interests wherever they're deployed, including, by the way, also in the past, within Iran. These same proxy forces have been brought in to murder Iranian protesters in the past. So the idea that these same forces could now be used again inside Iran against Iranian civilians should be deeply alarming, and the entire world should be aware of it. At the same time, it tells you exactly how far, once again, this regime is willing to go to hold on to power. This also totally undermines any claim to the regime's legitimacy because a government that's importing foreign terrorists to sustain itself during a crisis isn't functioning as a national authority. It's functioning as a survival mechanism, prioritizing its own continuation over the people that it claims to represent. So all this rhetoric about sovereignty, independence, and resistance totally collapses under the reality because you can't claim to defend your nation while simultaneously bringing in external militias to control it and kill your own citizens. So when people ask what ugly looks like in war, this is it. A regime that spent decades building a regional terror network, using that same network to stabilize itself internally and to murder Iranian citizens. A regime that's always interfered in other countries is doing so inside its own borders, and a regime that, when tested, reveals that its loyalty isn't to the Iranian people, but to its own survival at any cost. It's not just ugly, it's also clarity because it shows exactly what the system is when the pressure actually is real. And speaking of pressure, our bad story this week isn't much better. This is something that should remove any illusion about what the regime is and how it operates, because what you're seeing now isn't really a new behavior, rather a continuation of a pattern that goes back decades. The Islamic Republic announced this week that they're now recruiting children as young as 12 years old into its security apparatus, placing them in patrols, checkpoints, and internal enforcement roles tied to the IRGC and Basij networks, something already being reported across multiple outlets with direct links to regime structures, meaning they themselves are admitting this. These are actual functions inside a system designed to monitor, control, and if necessary, suppress the population during times of war. And if this sounds shocking, it should, but it shouldn't feel unfamiliar. After all, this is the same regime that during the Iran-Iraq war used children in massive numbers, in some cases sending boys as young as 12 into battlefields including minefields where they were effectively used to clear paths for advancing forces. There are documented accounts of children being given plastic keys to paradise and sent forward with the promise that dying would guarantee them entry to heaven, which tells you everything about how this regime has historically justified sacrificing its own youth. To clarify, this wasn't marginal. Tens of thousands of children were involved, many pulled from poor communities, many influenced through schools and propaganda, and many never came back, meaning that what you're seeing today isn't a deviation from that system. It's the same system, under pressure, reverting to what it has always done. And from a legal perspective, there is no ambiguity here. International law is very clear that children can't be used in military or paramilitary roles, including auxiliary and support functions tied to conflict environments. Recruiting 12-year-olds into patrols and checkpoints tied to a war effort is a direct violation of those standards, and it reflects complete disregard for the most basic protections afforded to minors. But beyond the legal issue, it also tells you something much more important about the regime. A government that's pulling its children into its security structure in the middle of war isn't stable. It's scrambling to sustain control. Expanding enforcement roles to include minors means the regime is widening its manpower pool at the lowest possible level, which is what happens when pressure builds and the system starts to crack. And there's another layer to this that shouldn't be ignored. The regime has already shown its willingness to kill its own youth. During recent protests, hundreds of civilians were killed, including hundreds of children, by the same IRGC and besieged structures that are now recruiting minors into their ranks. That is the system these kids are being brought into, one that's already been used against their own generation. So what you're looking at is a regime that has a history of sacrificing children in war, that is now recruiting children again, and that has already demonstrated it's willing to use force against children. It's not just a human rights issue, it's a regime that's spiraling under pressure and falling back on its most extreme and abusive tactics to survive. And for the Iranian people, especially the next generation, it means they're not just living under the system, they're literally being consumed by it. And to finish on a positive note, as always, our good story of the week, something we don't hear nearly enough of these days, clarity. This weekend, the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi stood on a stage at CPAC in Dallas before a packed crowd and stated that a free Iran isn't some distant fantasy, rather it's something that could actually be within reach right now. And more importantly, he also rejected the idea that you can negotiate your way into safety with this regime, warning very clearly that any partial deal that leaves elements of the Islamic Republic in place will only buy time for the same cycle of terrorism, nuclear escalation, and regional destabilization to continue. This is crucial for Americans to understand because it directly challenges the entire framework that has dominated Western policy for decades, which is the idea that this regime can be managed, moderated, or reformed, even now. Pahlavi made it clear that this isn't a system that can evolve into something benign and that the only real solution is dismantling it and allowing the Iranian people to determine their own future. But he didn't just stop at criticism, he's laid out a vision, and this is the part that people should pay close attention to. He described a future where Iran isn't isolated, not radical, but is integrated into the region and the international community as a partner, including normalizing relations with Israel and expanding what he calls the Cyrus Accords, building on the Abraham Accords model. He even framed this in economic terms, arguing that a free Iran could and will unlock over $1 trillion in economic opportunity and become one of the most significant strategic and economic partners in the region, and a key ally for the United States. Check it out.
Can you imagine Iran going from death to America to God bless America?
Quite the response. Love to see it. And the chants of USA, USA after are also absolutely amazing. I highly recommend listening to the entire speech because it was actually a fabulous speech, one of the best speeches I've heard from him. But overall, I mean, you see that is the contrast. On one side, we have a regime that's built on repression, that's built on terror and isolation. And on the other, you have a vision of a country that reconnects with its own history, its own people, and the world. No half measures, no illusions, just finish the job already. And with that, we do finish for this week, but we'll be back next week, as always, with more updates from across the region and all the latest from the war against the Islamic Republic. You can also follow our JNS Iran War Brief throughout the war every few days with the latest updates. And as always, if you think you have a story that we should cover, you can reach out to me on social media at Emily K. Schrader or on Instagram at Emily in Tel Aviv. Until next time, see you right here on Axis of Truth.
Hello and welcome to ILTV Insider. I'm your host, Mayan Hoffman. Tonight on Insider, as we prepare to welcome the Jewish holiday of Passover tomorrow night, here in Israel we are asking, will this holiday be marked by family and freedom, or by sirens and shelters? The war with Iran shows no clear end. President Donald Trump is promising a response to Iran's attack on Haifa, even as he says negotiations continue behind the scenes. No one is offering a timeline. So are we nearing a turning point or heading deeper into an escalation? Tonight, I'm joined by Dan Diker, president of the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs, and former AP chief Dan Perry, to unpack what it all means. Let's go ahead and get started. You know, I want to start with a question about the most recent post by U.S. President Donald Trump on his Truth Social platform. He is condemning France for not allowing U.S. planes to land and refuel while they were carrying military equipment over to Israel. And following that, Secretary of State Rubio responded by saying that potentially after this war, the United States will re-examine the NATO partnerships. Dan Diker, what do you think about this? What kind of chaos could this war ultimately lead to in terms of the relationship between the United States and its European partners?
Hi, Mayan. Thanks for having us on the show. This is just another example of what you call Trump maximal pressure on his European allies, for which he really has a lot of frustration, because particularly when it comes to the crisis in the Straits of Hormuz, and that the whole area from the Bab el-Mandeb Pass all the way north to Karg Island in the Straits, because Europe has as much vested interest in making sure that the Straits stay free. And he's very frustrated at the behavior, of the United Kingdom, as an example, not to mention France, whose sovereign bases in the island of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, as well as in Cyprus, were attacked. And they're still, the most that they could muster is to allow American planes to land on British air bases, but not to take a more active measure, to join the United States. So he's sort of ratcheting up tensions here, which, publicly, which I wonder if that's really the wisest move in view of this extremely unstable situation opposite the Iranian regime, and still the terror proxies that are still alive and kicking, whether it's Hezbollah, whether, Hamas is still laying in wait, and the Houthis have not yet gotten involved. So now is really the time for unity in the Western alliance, not for disunity.
Dan, can you respond to that?
I'm afraid I have to agree. The European position is absolutely craven and in some ways pitiful. They have as much of an interest as the U.S. and as Israel does in not only the Iranian regime being dissuaded from its various forms of misbehavior, but that the regime should fall, basically. They should be on side in this war, and Trump is right to be frustrated on one hand. However, as often happens in geopolitics, things are a little bit more complex. The Europeans themselves are at least as frustrated with Trump as he is with them, because they've just endured almost a year and a half of his disrespect, indifference, and insults, which have been needless and which in some cases have been shocking. The very NATO alliance that the U.S. now wants to re-examine was completely rattled a few months ago when Trump threatened to invade Denmark, essentially, in order to seize Greenland. The Europeans were stunned by this. The constant attacks on them for their supposed civilizational decline, for NATO being at various points in Trump's view obsolete. Clearly they're very upset. And the December national security strategy walked away from parts of the alliance, disassociated the U.S. from democracy promotion, and was an absolute shock to the system. So from the European perspective, it's a little bit rich that Trump now comes to them hat in hand and will draw conclusions from their lack of cooperation. But since it really is complex, at the same time, I would have hoped the Europeans would get over it just in this one instance. But I do understand that they're frustrated not just by Trump's overall attitude towards them, but the fact that they weren't consulted when Trump launched the war. That said, the bottom line is, of course, they should help because they have at least as big an interest as the U.S. does. But we see here the price of Trump's purposeful rattling of this alliance, and I think all sides should take a deep breath and reconsider.
Well, and certainly Trump has a record for having quite a strong rhetoric right now. Trump is also, if we want to talk about Iran's attack on our energy infrastructure, for example, Trump is saying that there will be a response by the United States, that there will be some kind of attack for Iran's attack on Haifa coming very soon. And yet at the same time, Dan Zeicher, maybe you can respond to this. The president is also talking about these negotiations. If there is an attack on some kind of energy infrastructure in Iran, what do you envision that attack will look like?
Well, that kind of speculation can get us into dangerous waters. But Mayan, it's a very fair question. I think that we need to look at what we do know as opposed to what we might think might happen. It's clear if we look at the ground that the president has ordered thousands and thousands of special forces, Marines that are here in the Middle East, that are in place, and others that are just about to arrive here. The United States has a massive power projection of some 70,000 troops and, many warships and 4 or 5 different aircraft carriers. Probably some 40% of the American military might is focused here in the Middle East. And President Trump, as only President Trump can do, is issuing conflicting messages to keep everybody confused, particularly the Iranian regime. So it's unclear what is going to happen. If I were a betting man, I'd have to put my money on that what I call the agreement of unconditional surrender, which is on which there's a moratorium right now until April 6th, that if American conditions are left unmet by the Iranian regime, that there will be some sort of targeted, limited ground action on one of 2 areas, either in the several islands in the Straits, not just Karj, which is, as we've heard reported over the last days, is responsible for 90% of Iran's energy export, but there are other very strategically located islands like Abu Musa, Larak, the Greater and Lesser Toom. These islands are basically a lock on the Straits, and it seems very reasonable to assess that Trump might send special forces to grab those, grab those islands, secure those islands, and then free up. There are hundreds of ships waiting to pass through the Straits that can't get through right now, and they have to sort of pay this huge toll, which is illegal under international law. Everything that Iran has done is illegal under international law because these are international waters, and it is unclear what Trump is going to do. But I would put my money on some American military action if the Straits are open. The second thing, of course, is the uranium enrichment problem. Under 62% enriched uranium, 480 kilograms under 3 major sites. And that is an issue of equal concern to Israel as is the United States. So those are the 2 areas I think there will be action taken if there is not a comprehensive agreement by April 6th.
Now, Dan Dijker, why is Israel not responsible for taking that action himself when it comes to the energy infrastructure? The attack was on Haifa. When we speak specifically about that, what role will Israel play then in the response?
You mean to the Iranian attack on Haifa just now?
Exactly.
Well, you're right. It was an attack on Israel's sovereignty, and obviously Israel has the full right to respond with full force. I was actually it was quite remarkable that the United States, that Trump made a very sort of a principled took a principled position that they would take some sort of action following the attack on Haifa. I think it's one of the first times we've heard the president say that he would respond, or the United States would respond on a direct attack on Israel.
For sure. And now, Dan Perry, I just want to turn back to you for a moment because, while Trump is making these threats, as I mentioned before, we're also talking about ongoing negotiations taking place. Now, the question that I have for you is, can the U.S. really negotiate while also preparing to strike such a serious way at the same time? Doesn't that look kind of awkward to the global community and certainly to Iran?
It not only can, these are interrelated processes. Obviously, the threats to take action are meant to achieve leverage in the negotiations. And I find it very difficult to believe that the Iranians, who in public at least deny that they're even negotiating, are going to capitulate on any of these points anytime soon, because unfortunately, the dynamic that has been allowed to emerge is that they feel like they're winning, and they think it's reasonable for them to assume they can outlast the patience of the West. And therefore, even though my inclination is not to recommend escalation and to seek an off-ramp somehow that is helpful, I think in this case I have to suspect very strongly that that Trump is looking for a way to deliver a more clear message to the Iranians that they are wrong in their assessment that they have all this leverage. And that could take the form of actual troops on Karg Island or the other islands, or maybe even, if they want to really deliver a symbolic message, and this is more dangerous, seizing Iranian mainland territory across from Oman at the narrowest point of the Strait of Hormuz. Obviously, if you're on the mainland, you become more vulnerable to insurgencies, to terrestrial attacks, and so forth. But I have to think that some version of American escalation is coming, and the threat needs to be credible, which is why he's making it in public. I also would not be hugely surprised to see Trump and the U.S. declare a complete oil embargo on Iran. The crazy thing is that even though the world right now, and this mainly affects directly Asia, is not getting oil out of the Persian Gulf, Iran's oil exports have risen. And this is not right. This equation is unbalanced. And of course, the fear, and this is the fear that was paralyzing for the Biden administration over the years, and Trump may be falling into the same trap, is that if he takes direct measures to limit totally the Iranian export of oil, that'll cause a spike in prices. But you know what? Markets may conclude that that could speed up the end of the war, and that itself could be a reassuring factor. In short, I'm not surprised to see both threats and claims of negotiation, and I would be very surprised to see the kind of Iranian capitulation that is necessary to end the war with a positive narrative for the West and for Israel without some version of further escalation.
Yeah, 100%. And we're certainly hearing that, the American people are saying, well, we could suffer for the short term, but certainly not for the long term when it comes to those oil prices. And if that would speed up the end of the war and potentially give a win, without question. And also here in Israel, where the rockets, the sirens continue to hit down here in the country, all throughout the center of the country. Just in the last day, we saw a lot of damage and some injuries. Now, Passover, of course, starts tonight or tomorrow night at sundown. Is there any chance at all that this war with Iran could realistically quiet down even more by Wednesday night? Or should Israelis really prepare for sirens and more terror through the holiday? Dan Diker, what do you think?
Well, if as an optimist, I would say that maybe the Iranians would respect the Seder night and stop shooting, but I'm not sure that that's reasonable to assume under the circumstances. And I think that Israel is clearly, Mayan, perhaps the most resilient society in the free world. And the most, disciplined society under fire in the free world. I don't think any country in the West has ever faced this type of all-out, not only strategic, but almost existential threat on 7 different fronts around a country the size of Maryland or New Jersey. So I do think Israel has to be on guard completely the way it has in the days leading up to Pesach, to the holiday of Passover. And let's also be aware for our friends in the Christian world that we're approaching Easter and Easter Sunday as well. So these are very troubling. These are very, very troubling times. And I do think we're near a breaking point in terms of the Iranian regime. I think we could, in the coming days, see some if there is no agreement, some real, I think, surprises and changes on the ground. Just one particular comment based on what Dan said, which is a very insightful comment about the Iranian regime's inability to admit that it is really, it's all of its capabilities, its naval capabilities, its Air Force capabilities, its missile capabilities are all being destroyed, and yet they think they're winning. And the reason is, well, why is that? And the answer is, when you are a messianic Islamist jihadist regime, you are blind to objective reality, and you are completely given to ideological commitment, which is first and foremost never to give up. There is no white flag coming out of the Iranian regime. They either will die as shahidim, as martyrs, or they believe they'll win as victors. It's a religiously fueled commitment, and that is one of the reasons they're unable to see what even the Nazis saw at the end in 1945, and what Imperial Japan saw when there was unconditional surrender in World War II. No such thing happening with the Iranian regime.
Well, unfortunately, the difference is, and I've thought a lot about this, you have certain kind of dictatorships that are really dependent on one person who's sui generis, and if you eliminate that one person, then the regime understands that the game is up, and that was obviously the case with the Nazi regime, and it's occurred throughout history at various times. Sadly, for the rest of the world and for the region, for the people of Iran, that is not the case with the Iranian regime, where you have at least 1 million people and probably more who are totally committed, and as you say, Dan Diker, fanatical. And for this reason, I try to be an optimist, but I also try to be a realist. I would expect Iranian attacks on Seder night and throughout the week. There's no reason to think they're going to respect the holiday. That's close to absurd. I do agree that something has to happen, however, in Iran, and I have a lot of conversations, some public, some not, with Iranian opposition diaspora leaders, and are so optimistic that eventually the Iranian people will rise up. I think at some point that needs to be part of the plan. In other words, we don't have unlimited time. And the scenario has to be that, since we all know that this regime is best replaced, first and foremost for the people of Iran. And replacing the regime cannot happen purely through aerial bombardment, probably, especially when they're this fanatical. And therefore, an internal process needs to amass. And I would welcome not only subterranean talks with the Iranian military and even maybe parts of the Revolutionary Guard to offer them amnesty, to offer them exit, to offer them the ability to keep their plunder maybe, but as long as they step aside and betray the regime, and mainly to make clear two things. One, if the war pauses, let's say, and wars can pause. The previous 12-day war paused, basically. And the Iranians the Iranian regime lives another day. We have to make clear that we will protect the people who then go out into the streets, and there are plans for people to go out into the streets. We have to present a plan as to how we're going to prevent another massacre, and at the same time, on the carrot side, the West and the entire West, and this time, not just Trump, who runs a weirdly monarchic operation in the US, but the West, NATO, the EU, everyone needs to get together and present the Iranians as a people and as a transition government, hopefully, with a whole series of carrots as to what they're going to get if they somehow compel the regime to surrender or help defeat the regime. And that would include, obviously, an unfreezing of all assets, an end to all sanctions, and a maximal welcoming into the family of nations.
Well, and Dan, I think it's pretty obvious that that's what the United States and everybody else will want to be giving to a new Iranian regime if it is a peaceful regime. But I think, as you and Dan both said, with a fanatical regime, you can't really expect that it's just going to come down, even if the people go to the streets, and that you're going to be able to prevent some kind of massacre.
Note that it's not articulated. Trump is really good at making threats, but an eloquent articulation of the unbelievable upside that the Iranian people and the region and the world stand to receive if only everyone can unite against the regime. And I would loop back to the beginning, including the Europeans, presenting a positive narrative and not just a negative one can create momentum and can influence geopolitics.
It's true. There's only, I just put one, what they say in Hebrew, kochavit, a semicolon but, as my professor used to say at college. And that is that when the President Trump negotiates with the regime, he undermines, unintentionally undermines the Iranian people's confidence in him. And having had a number of conversations in recent days, we have Iranian, Israeli people working at the Jerusalem Center and others in Europe. They all say that, when you reach out to the regime, even nominally, even, as a psyop, if you will, to be very cynical about it, you're really undermining the confidence of the Iranian people to come out into the streets, because they say, well, how can we trust President Trump, even though we know President Trump has done more than any other U.S. president to help the Iranian people by neutering the regime. But from a cognitive standpoint, Dan, what I've learned is that the Iranian people, I mean, at least 70% of them, because the regime does command a substantial amount, even 20%, including family and friends, support, which is, 25 million people still support the regime out of 95 or close to 100 million people. But it undermines that majority of people that say, can we really trust the president to go the full term with us?
I agree. It's a delicate calibration. I am basically calling for speaking to the Iranian people over the heads of the regime, but also, in so doing, delivering a message to potential rogue elements within the regime.
Right.
Now, I want to jump back to where we started at the beginning, because we are going to have to wrap up in just a couple of minutes. Dan Diker, we started speaking about the Straits of Hormuz, and Netanyahu, of course, recently raised the idea of rerouting pipelines through Saudi Arabia to bypass the Strait of Hormuz. Speaking of truce or falsehoods, how realistic is that, and how long would something like that even take? Is that relevant today?
I think it is relevant, Mayan. In other words, there have been reports of potential pathway talks to normalization with Saudi Arabia. The United States is in a very advantaged position vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia. Clearly, there have been a lot of talks under the radar between the Saudi leadership, Mohammed bin Salman in particular, and the president and his team, and that we can see a scenario, a likely scenario, that if America uses its full force and takes control of the Iranian regime economy, essentially collapsing the viability, the economic viability of the regime, the Saudis will go with the winner, and the cost to the Saudis can be normalization, and part of the cost of normalization, even though there's a lot of upside for the Saudis, is an east-west pipeline that would go across Saudi Arabia, avoid the Straits of Hormuz altogether, and go up through the canal and into Ashkelon, and Haifa ports, making Israel a main global energy stop on the way to the West.
And I would just add that is very much in line with the several-year-old initiative called IMEC, which envisions India being part of a grand corridor, not just of land transport, but in general, a corridor going through the Arabian Peninsula, circumnavigating the Persian Gulf entirely, through Israel, onto Europe, envisioning regional infrastructure integration. It could be spectacular, and this, weirdly, could accelerate it.
Yeah.
And so just to wrap us up, we really only have about 10 seconds left. Dan Diker, I just want you to give me a vision then for whether or not the Israeli people are going to be able to sustain through the Passover holiday, and who knows how much longer. Do we have the strength to do it? Really, 10-second answer to give us a moment of hope.
5 seconds. The Jewish people have survived 3,600 years of dictators, and they will get through this latest challenge by the Iranian regime's dictators as well. I'm fully confident of that.
Thank you so much, because we always like to leave on a positive note, but unfortunately we are out of time. So I really want to thank both Dans for being here tonight, and I want to wish all of our viewers a safe and pleasant evening. If you found this discussion valuable, please check out the ILTV podcast for a further series of in-depth interviews on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Mayan Hoffman. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
At U Haifa International, academic excellence isn't just a standard, it's a way of life. With 21 English-taught master's programs, world-class faculty, and Israel's top national score in the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings, students grow in every direction.
If you really want to challenge yourself academically, grow in a very diverse community, and be immersed in such an important and significant environment, University of Haifa is the place for you.
Located on the stunning Carmel Ridge, the U Haifa blends academic excellence with a welcoming community.
U Haifa International has a great combination of top-notch academics with a great community of students.
Whether you're pursuing a one-year master's or diving into research, U Haifa gives you the tools, mentorship, and real-life insight to make your mark on the world. U Haifa International. Master your mind, live your Israel experience.
ILTV News, your source for Israel in English. Reporting from the ground where it happens, as it happens. An authentic, trusted voice in daily Israel news. Airing on 11 international TV channels and now launching a 24/7 Israeli news channel. Reaching millions every month across all social platforms. Independent, real, powered by truth. We don't just report, we connect, thanks to a worldwide community that stands for truth. This is ILTV, your source for Israel in English.
Welcome back to ILTV on the Hour. I'm Caleb Ben David, coming to you live from Israel, bringing you all of the biggest headlines from across the region. Here are the latest developments. It is now day 2 of the 2-week ceasefire declared between the U.S. and Iran. Overnight, U.S. President Donald Trump renewed his threat to use unprecedented force against Iran if it does not comply with the terms of the ceasefire. Trump posted this statement: "All U.S. ships, aircraft, and military personnel, with additional ammunition, weaponry, and anything else that is appropriate and necessary for the lethal prosecution and destruction of an already substantially degraded enemy, will remain in place in and around Iran until such time as the real agreement reached is fully complied with." But Trump is facing a new diplomatic test as he prepares for high-stakes talks with Iran this weekend, with the ceasefire already showing signs of strain. According to a White House official, Vice President J.D. Vance will lead a U.S. delegation to Islamabad, Pakistan on Saturday for direct talks with Iranian officials. Vance will be joined by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and President Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner. The talks will take place under the 2-week clock established by the ceasefire agreement, with the Trump administration hoping to turn the temporary halt in fighting into a broader lasting agreement. But even before the weekend, cracks are already emerging. Iran's parliament speaker, Mohammad Baghir Ghalibaf, claimed that 3 elements of what he described as a 10-point agreed framework have already been violated. Among them, he said, was a halt to Israeli strikes against Iran-backed Hezbollah forces in Lebanon, a condition the Trump administration says was never part of the agreement. Ghalibaf also criticized Washington after U.S. officials reiterated that Iran will never be permitted to maintain a domestic uranium enrichment program, which is a long-standing demand from Tehran. In a sharply worded statement, he warned that under these conditions, continued negotiations, or even the ceasefire itself, may be in jeopardy. Trump says the Pakistani proposal provides a workable basis for negotiations. This does signal a shift after previous demands for unconditional surrender. Now, as part of the deal, the Strait of Hormuz, a vital global energy corridor, is expected to be reopened, with Iran signaling that maritime traffic will require coordination with the Tehran regime, potentially including heavy fees that could provide a source of revenue for the Iranian economy. Now, Trump has called these developments a big day for world peace and says the U.S. will assist in managing traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, also indicating American forces will remain present in the region. Now, officials in Jerusalem are concerned the ceasefire does not resolve the core issues that led to the war, including Iran's nuclear program, its ballistic missiles program, and support for terror proxies. Iran's enriched uranium stockpile is still buried underground, and arrangements have yet to be agreed upon for its removal. Trump stated Iran will not be permitted to enrich uranium, and claims the U.S. will work with Tehran to remove the already highly enriched material, but there's no confirmation from Iran it has accepted those terms. Vice President Vance says a deal is possible if Iran acts in good faith, but warns Washington retains significant leverage if negotiations fail or are undermined.
The president did is he basically issued an ultimatum to the Iranians. He said, open up the straits, stop trying to hold the world's economy hostage, and we'll engage in a ceasefire. And that's exactly the agreement that we came to last night. The Iranians have agreed to open up the straits. The United States has agreed to stop attacking. And that, not just the United States, but also our allies, have agreed to stop attacking. And that is the basis of this fragile truce that we have, which is now, 8 to 12 hours old.
Now, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is publicly backing the announced ceasefire and has committed to halting Israeli airstrikes on Iran. But Netanyahu is referring to the agreement as a temporary suspension of fighting. The Prime Minister's office said in a statement that Israel supports President Trump's decision to suspend strikes against Iran for 2 weeks, subject to Iran immediately opening the straits and stopping all attacks on the U.S., Israel, and other countries in the region. The Israeli Air Force has not carried out any strikes in Iran since around 3 a.m. yesterday, this following a final wave of attacks just before the ceasefire took effect. The military adds that in line with political directives, it has now ceased fire but remains on high alert and is ready to respond to any ceasefire violations. Now, last night, Netanyahu addressed the nation to sum up Operation Roaring Lion.
יש לנו עוד יעדים להשלים, ואנחנו נשיג אותם, או בהסכמה, או בחידוש הלחימה. כי אנחנו ערוכים לחזור ללחימה בכל רגע שידרש. האצבע על ההדק. הלילה נכנסה לתוקפה הפסקת אש זמנית בת שבועיים בין ארצות הברית לבין איראן, בתיאום מלא עם ישראל. לא, הם לא הפתיעו אותנו ברגע האחרון. עכשיו אני מבקש להדגיש, זה איננו סיומה של המערכה. זו תחנה בדרך להשגת כל היעדים שלנו. וביחס לחומר המואשר שעדיין נותר באיראן. כפי שאמרו היום בכירי ממשל טראמפ, החומר המואשר יצא כולו מאיראן. או שהוא יצא בהסכמה, או שהוא יצא בחידוש לחימה. ואנחנו רואים עין בעין בנושא הזה. עכשיו אני עמדתי על כך, שהפסקת האש הזמנית עם איראן לא תכלול את חיזבאללה. ואנחנו ממשיכים להכות בו בעוצמה.
Well, as we just heard from the Prime Minister, Israel is insisting that the 2-week ceasefire does not apply to the war against Hezbollah in Lebanon. President Trump called that conflict a separate skirmish, making clear that Lebanon was not part of the Iran ceasefire deal. Hezbollah is continuing to fire rockets in northern Israel, with the most recent alerts just over the last hour. Those projectiles were intercepted by air defense systems. Yesterday, the Israeli Air Force says it carried out its largest waves of airstrikes against Hezbollah since the start of the fighting, targeting around 100 sites. According to the IDF, the strikes hit locations in Beirut, the Bekaa Valley in South Lebanon, including command centers, intelligence headquarters, and other military infrastructure used by the terror group. The IDF says the targets included facilities linked to Hezbollah's rocket, naval, and aerial units, as well as assets belonging to its elite Radwan force. Now, the IDF described the operation as the most extensive strike on Hezbollah infrastructure since the beginning of Operation Roaring Lion, adding that many of the sites were deliberately located within civilian areas. Ahead of the strikes, evacuation orders were issued to civilians in those targeted areas, including parts of Beirut's southern suburbs. The IDF says it has also completed deployment along a strategic anti-tank defensive line inside South Lebanon, with the military saying troops are now fully positioned along a ridge several kilometers inside Lebanon, designed to prevent Hezbollah from launching anti-tank missile attacks on Israeli border communities. That so-called anti-tank line is part of a broader defensive strategy, with the IDF working to establish a buffer zone extending towards the Litani River, aimed at removing threats to northern Israel. IDF Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir has outlined a multi-layered defense concept, including clearing border villages of Hezbollah infrastructure and securing positions deeper inside Lebanon to prevent infiltration and rocket fire. Defense Minister Israel Katz says hundreds of Hezbollah terrorists were killed in yesterday's airstrikes. He also had this to say.
צה"ל תקף במהלומת פתע מאות מחבלי חיזבאללה במפקדות ברחבי לבנון. זוהי המכה המרוכזת הגדולה ביותר שסופג החיזבאללה מאז מבצע הביפרים. עמדנו על בידול הזירות בין איראן ללבנון כדי לשנות את המציאות בלבנון ולהסיר איומים מעל תושבי הצפון. הזנו את נעים קאסם שהחיזבאללה ישלם מחיר גבוה מאוד על תקיפת ישראל בשליחות איראן, והיום מימשנו עוד שלב בהבטחה. גם תורו האישי של הארכי-טרוריסט נעים קאסם יגיע. כוחות צה"ל ממשיכים לפעול בעוצמה בלבנון להרחקת איומים ולסיכול יכולות החיזבאללה בהתאם למדיניות אותה קבענו. הבטחנו להביא ביטחון לתושבי הצפון, וכך בדיוק נעשה.
Unfortunately, as the battle against Hezbollah goes on, another Israeli soldier was killed and 5 others were wounded yesterday during a clash with terrorists in South Lebanon. The slain soldier is named as Staff Sergeant Tuvel Yosef Lifshitz. He was 20 years old, served in the Golani Brigade's 13th Battalion, and hails from the town of Beit Shan. Lifshitz is the 12th soldier to be killed since fighting renewed with Hezbollah. May his memory be a blessing. Now, most Israeli schools reopened today as Home Front Command eased restrictions. The IDF Home Front Command has also updated its guidelines, announcing schools will reopen in most of the country, or they did reopen in the country at 6 a.m. Now, under these new directives, limits on public gatherings are lifted, signaling a broader easing of wartime restrictions. However, in areas close to the northern border with Lebanon, the existing restrictions will remain in place for now, due to, of course, continued security concerns. Officials are cautiously moving toward a partial return to routine while monitoring the security situation, waiting to see if the 2-week ceasefire will hold. Also, Israel has announced plans for a full resumption of operations at Ben Gurion Airport, with flights potentially returning to normal amid the ceasefire. Now, since the outbreak of the conflict on February 28th, Israel's airspace has been largely closed to commercial traffic, with only limited emergency flights operated by Israeli airlines, including El Al, Arkia, and Israel. Arkia says it is preparing to resume a full flight schedule starting May 3rd, which includes destinations across Europe, the US, and Asia. The low-cost carrier Wizz Air says it will not resume flights to Israel until at least April 27th, citing continued uncertainty, as most foreign airlines remain suspended despite the ceasefire. Officials stress that any full return to normal operations will have to depend on the security situation, with adjustments expected as the conditions evolve. Now, joining us now for more on all of this is Colonel Richard Kemp, the former commander of British forces in Afghanistan. And we have from the U.S. Khosrow Isfahani. He is the research director at NUFTI, that's the National Union for Democracy in Iran. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Richard, I want to start with you. Get your reaction to the ceasefire agreement. We'll dig down to the specifics in a bit, but I guess the big question is, what are the odds you believe that this agreement this ceasefire will lead to agreement, or even last over 2 weeks?
Well, I think it would be optimistic to expect the Islamic Republic of Iran to stick to its word on anything. They haven't done so in the past, and I think it's highly unlikely they're going to do so now. We've already seen examples of that in the news that you spoke about just recently, of their differences of opinion with the United States over the terms of the deal. So I think it's not entirely likely that they will stick to it, but it is a possibility. And the reason I say that this time is that Iran, the Islamic Republic, is in fear now. They have had immense devastation delivered to them, both in terms of the regime itself, which has been sliced off from the top right several layers down, the enormous economic damage, the enormous damage to their military capabilities, including their nuclear capabilities, and their energy infrastructure. And President Trump was offering to deliver even more as the days were going on. And I think that's what led to their capitulation, their dropping of their demands for a ceasefire, which was that there would be a permanent end to the war, and a few other issues that they now have dropped. So I think I don't think anybody really knows, and no one can really predict either what President Trump's going to do and not what the Islamic regime is going to do.
Right. And Khosrow, I also want to hear what the Iranian community, either in Iran or, of course, those abroad like yourself, their reaction to this ceasefire. One aspect we have to note is that, as far as we know, the U.S. proposal doesn't include any changes in the regime. In fact, President Trump, some other White House officials continue to talk as if regime changes happen in Iran. How is the news of the ceasefire being received?
So immediately after the ceasefire was announced, I received a text message from someone in Tehran. It opened with, "What the hell?" And the message continued. What happened? Why the United States has decided to make a ceasefire with the Islamic Republic? The hyenas of this regime are shouting in victory and celebration on the streets. And the message continued. This is going to translate into our worst nightmare. The Islamic Republic staying in place, surviving this battering, surviving it, and turning its rage, humiliation against the unarmed Iranian population. We already are seeing signs of that violence being redirected at the Iranian people. The regime has dispatched military force across the country, armed to the teeth and ready to kill anyone who just crosses the slightest red line of this regime. So people inside the country are extremely anxious about how the Islamic Republic is going to behave. But at the same time, when you talk with Iranians, we know that considering the language that this regime is portraying around this ceasefire, you mentioned the 10-point deal that has been put forward by the Islamic Republic. They're demanding to maintain control over the Strait of Hormuz, maintain nuclear enrichment, and the list goes on and on and on. If it's actually the basis for the ceasefire, if this is the basis for the ceasefire, it was the United States that capitulated in face of the Islamic Republic. That sounds ridiculous. The United States has no reason to capitulate in face of a battered regime that is at its weakest point, giving the regime everything that it has ever wanted, from nuclear enrichment to control over the Strait of Hormuz. So I don't think that the ceasefire is going to hold. The pause is literally just that, a pause in the confrontation that the Islamic Republic started 5 decades ago when it was created. This regime has been at war with the Iranian people, with the world, with the United States, with Israel and the whole region, and it's not going to stop because this war, perpetual war, is part of this regime's DNA, and it cannot change.
Right. We should note there have been contradictory reports about what exactly is in these agreements. I didn't report on it because we really don't know what really is, if either Iran or the U.S. are dissembling, or they just actually, Pakistan gave out 2 different drafts to the U.S. and Iran. But Richard, I certainly would like you to respond to some of what Khosrow has said. But let's talk a little about the Strait of Hormuz, because one thing that it is said is that it really is looking like that's going to be a key issue, and is going to be if there isn't any agreement, it's going to be very different than what existed prior to the start of this conflict.
Yeah, I think I would certainly defer to Khosrow in his assessment of the reaction of the regime and what's going on inside Iran. Of course, he knows much more about it than I do. I think no matter what terms had or hadn't been agreed, and even if Iran was right, the Islamic Republic of Iran, I want to differentiate between the country of Iran and the regime. I think that's quite important. Even if it was absolutely on its knees and was almost down to the last fighter, they would still declare victory no matter what. So I don't think we can pay too much attention to what they're actually saying and what they're deciding or what they're announcing. But as far as the Strait of Hormuz is concerned, I don't think President Trump can possibly tolerate the kind of conditions that Iran seems to want in the Strait of Hormuz, whether it's a $1 million fee for every tanker coming through, whatever it might be. I don't think President Trump can tolerate that. If anyone's going to collect tolls for ships going through the Strait of Hormuz, it needs to be the United States and Israel, who have brought this situation where it is. And they're the ones, if anyone, who should have funds into their accounts for the amount of expenditure they've placed on trying to do away with this regime. But I think I really don't think that that's going to be the most significant stumbling block. I think it is important, but I do believe that the highly enriched uranium stocks inside Iran are another major point that, again, Trump's going to, I think, be quite insistent upon. He obviously wants this. There's no doubt in my mind he wants this war to end. He really does. But I think he's a man of steel, and I don't think he will tolerate the Islamic Republic rejecting his conditions. I think he will, if necessary, return to the fight. And Israel would certainly do that, in my view.
Sure. Well, Khosrow, you talked about the regime being weakened. Is there any chance at all it will compromise in any way, which we haven't seen until now, on the nuclear issue, both enriching uranium domestically and the removal of that enriched uranium that many people presume are buried under some of the key nuclear sites?
A couple of quick points. One, with this military operation, with the targeted killing of the Islamic Republic's leadership, the Islamic Republic right now is brain dead and its agents are acting based on muscle memory. They have zero creative thinking going on within the regime. They are literally playing by the playbook that they have always played. Escalate until the war de-escalates. And so far it has worked to some extent with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, with all the economic crisis that was caused around the world, with the regime targeting 12 nations around the Iranian borders in addition to Israel and United States targets. The Islamic Republic has achieved ground in that sense. It has forced the world to de-escalate. That has been the Islamic Republic's playbook for the past 5 decades. Whenever they face an adversary from outside, they just start acting as if it's irrational, striking at everyone and everything, scaring the world into submission. But you ask whether the regime is going to be willing to give up things like its nuclear enrichment program, its missile program, its sponsorship of terrorism. The answer is simple. Absolutely no. Because the solution for the Islamic Republic is absolute annihilation or total humiliating surrender. This regime has not reached either of those points. The regime is still standing, so not annihilated, and the surrender, it has not happened. The regime is picturing itself as the victor. If they accept giving up all those arms of their actual triangle of security doctrine, that would be humiliating. That would lead to the absolute collapse of the Islamic Republic. So they will not give up what they see as their deterrence, as their bloodline, as what they can use to stay in power. And Secretary Rubio in 2015, when the JCPOA was being signed, delivered a speech here in the United States detailing what was going to happen as an aftermath to the nuclear deal. The Islamic Republic, he said, is going to pursue weapons of mass destruction, will expand its missile range, will sponsor terrorism, and all the predictions he made in 2015 came to pass because it's in the nature of the Islamic Republic. This regime is incapable of fundamental change. It's not going to change course. It's going to continue what it has been doing for the past 5 decades. There is one solution for it: absolute annihilation or total humiliating surrender. This ceasefire is not going to last. It's going to fall apart sooner or later. And as the colonel mentioned, Donald Trump, regardless of what you think about him, regardless of all the critics that try to bash him, there is one thing about this man: he has zero patience for this type of bullying. And the Islamic Republic at its core is an absolute bully. And Trump is going to stomach it for a day or two or a month or 2 months, but he will be back at pounding the Islamic Republic soon.
Right. Now, one of the points that seem to be contradictory in the Iranian and U.S. versions is the issue of the war in Lebanon and Hezbollah. And Richard, I want to ask you about that. Hezbollah continues to fire rockets. Israel continues to strike even more seriously now at Hezbollah operations. Can Israel maintain its offensive against Hezbollah as the ceasefire goes on and handle international pressure, and hasn't clearly defined its goals enough in order to keep that going, both on the home front and also on the international front?
Yeah, I think that, in my opinion, and obviously this is not a decision for me, and other people have a lot more information about it than I do, but in my opinion, the IDF should keep hammering Hezbollah into destruction as far as that can be achieved. And they've been working very hard on them. My hope now is that some of the air power that was dedicated to the Iranian regime will now be transferred to Hezbollah, and they will see significant devastation. I think that is what should be happening. I don't say that there's no prospect that one way or another, Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump will come to an agreement whereby hostilities in Lebanon are paused in the interests, at least in the interests of appearing to pursue a diplomatic track. I think that's a possibility. I don't know. But I think it would be a mistake to suspend hostilities in Lebanon for any significant length of time. They've got Hezbollah on the back foot now. And I do note also that countries like my own, the UK, and other Western countries have insisted that the Lebanon ceasefire be part of the Iran deal. I think that is hugely presumptuous. They have no voice in this. They haven't played a role. They didn't play a role in the ceasefire in Iran. They didn't, in many cases, provide the proper support to the United States. They have no right to have an opinion on that. I think the people, you mentioned whether or not the case has been made for continuing this conflict. I know a lot of people in northern Israel, and I know for sure they want this to go on. They've been living in fear for many years of Hezbollah and its rockets and its forces coming across the border to murder them. And the people throughout Israel, I'm sure, but certainly in the north, want this offensive to continue until it's ended.
Khosrow, we know how far Hezbollah will go to protect Iran's interests, attacking Israel, even though Israel was not in an offensive against Lebanon at the time. How far is the Iranian regime willing to go to protect Hezbollah? They're saying that Hezbollah, that this ceasefire should include Lebanon. Are they going to be willing to resume for example, just their attacks on Israel if the conflict in Lebanon continues?
Hezbollah is just a mercenary force that serves the Islamic Republic. They have been paid by this regime over the past decades. They have been created by the Islamic Republic. All their doctrine, their policies, their strategy, all of it comes from Tehran. Hezbollah knows that it wouldn't exist if the Islamic Republic falls, so they are going to go down with this regime as far as they can. The same way that the Iraqi militias were dispatched to Iran over the past couple of weeks. Literally, the Hashd al-Sha'bi sent forces to Iran in case the regime faces protests in the country, so it would have forces there, Iraqi forces on Iranian soil to kill Iranians that might rise up against the regime. Same goes with this Hezbollah. They are a bunch of thugs that are going to fight as long as their patron in Tehran keeps paying them.
Right. And Richard, the Iranian regime, which is fanatical and certainly willing to at least sacrifice some of its leaders to continue, has shown itself resistant to some degree to military action, short of boots on the ground, which President Trump seems committed not to do. If the war is to continue, it certainly would probably need some kind of real, true global economic pressure in order to weaken the regime to the point of toppling it. Do you see any chance of the international community, and you mentioned the UK, Europe, finally joining in putting that kind of pressure on the Iranian regime, which they have been reluctant to do until this point?
I think the Europeans are extremely weak at this moment, and I include the UK in that. And a large element of their weakness comes from fear of their own populations inside their countries, and not violent fear, but fear of losing their votes. And that's why they didn't join in and cooperate fully with President Trump in the war against the Islamic Republic. They should have done that, but they were afraid of joining a war that was against an Islamic State. And not only that, but they were terrified of the idea of joining a war in which Israel was a participant on the same side. That was the thing I think that really stuck them in their tracks, which is shameful and an embarrassment, I think, for any upstanding citizen of a European country. So I don't think we're going to see a huge amount of economic action by the Europeans either. I think they're, we might see them being pressured into it by President Trump potentially, but I think it's going to be really kicking and screaming that they do that. And meanwhile, they've really taken, in some ways, they've taken the side of Iran, and including by this insistence I mentioned before that Lebanon is included in the ceasefire.
All right, well, we'll have to end it at that. Richard Kem, Khosrow Isfahani, so thank you so much for joining us here on ILTV. That is a wrap for this edition of On the Hour. We're broadcasting live from Israel in the Middle East. Stay tuned for the latest developments, or of course you can go to our social media platforms or our app. There's a QR code on your screen. I'm Khaled Ben David, and thank you for joining us.
Trump extends the deadline for negotiations just as cracks are forming inside Iran's regime. So, are the Iranian regime and Trump looking for an off-ramp, or is this the art of the next Middle East deal? Welcome back, everybody, to the Quad. Are the Iranian Islamic leadership showing cracks? Well, look what the daughter of an ex-president had to say.
چرا؟ چون الان ما خودمون از اسرائیل، از آمریکا، از هر جا که ما میریم تو دنیا بدن، از رژیم پهلوی دیگه ما نمیتونیم بگیم اسرائیل بده، شاه بد بود، اون بد بود، این بده، اون بده. چون الان فعلا خودمون از همه بدتریم و بلاهایی داریم سر مردم خودمون میاریم تو همه زمینه‌ها، هیچ کدوم از اینا به این میزان نیوردن. حالا اسرائیل رو که گفتم، دوست دارم اینو بگم. ببینید شما آمار کشته‌های سوریه، فقط کشته‌هاش، حالا آواره‌هاش و تخریباش و مهاجرینش اینا رو کاری نداریم، 500,000 نفره که به حال ما تو این قضیه نقش داشتیم. یا یمن الان ببینیم 7 سال جنگ داخلیه که ما تو این قضیه نقش داشتیم و ما داریم مسلمان کشی را انداختیم. شما مجموع کشته‌های فلسطینی‌ها توسط اسرائیل رو اگر حساب کنید، من بعید می‌دونم به مثلا 100,000 یا 200,000 تا هم به تازه برسه. برای ما الان مسلمان کشیمون بیشتر از اسرائیل شده.
Well, to unpack all this and much more, my wonderful panel today, Emily Schrader, human rights activist and journalist, Shoshana Keats-Jaskal, founder of Chokhmat Nashim, elevating Orthodox women's voices, and today, a very special co-host guest, Ambassador Mark Regev, who is the co-host of his own show with our very own Ruthie Bloom, Israel Undiplomatic. Okay, is hell freezing over, Emily, when the daughter of an ex-president, Rafsanjani, who herself was a member of the Iranian parliament, is actually saying and making more sense than Tucker Carlson?
I mean, I hate to rain on the parade, but I don't think so. This is kind of what the reformist camp within Iran does when they're trying to gain legitimacy. I think her comments within the Iranian context are actually more about political maneuvering and political positioning inside of Iran than they are about the reality. However, even a broken clock is right twice a day, and she certainly is correct in that the Islamic Republic is responsible for more deaths of Muslims and Muslim Arabs in the region than any other single entity or even organization, both through the IRGC, but also through all of these proxy terror groups, as she actually mentioned herself. But I don't want anyone to be confused. This woman is actually evil, okay? She's a part of the regime. That's not changing. But she is right on this one.
But if she is a part of the regime, Ambassador, wouldn't this be heresy? I mean, isn't this heresy? Shouldn't they be like out with the pitchforks because she's saying that they've killed more people, more Muslims than we have?
So I think there are signs of cracks. Is it all falling apart just yet? I don't know.
Right.
I have no doubt that this regime, its days are numbered. How many days?
Yeah.
I can't tell you. I don't think anyone can tell you. Yeah. I would remind you that all authoritarian regimes rely on the fear they instill in their people.
Yeah.
And they have to be strong to be able to impose that fear. And because this regime has been exposed by Israel and the United States as being a weak regime, the cracks in the regime just become larger and stronger. Now, between June last year, when we exposed for the first time before the public of Iran how weak the regime was, it took 7 months, not until January, June till January, for the protests to come out.
Sure.
So maybe we won't see protests while the fighting is on, maybe not in the weeks immediately following the end of the fighting. But I have no doubt that the seeds for the destruction of this regime are beginning to sprout.
Amen. And I think you're right. And, you know, already we saw some differences of opinion between the current president and the IRGC when one of them said, Pezeshkian said, no, we're not attacking the Gulf. And the next thing they know is that they're sending rockets to the Gulf. I mean, can it not? I mean, how can it not be showing cracks? That's my question. After everything that we're doing and the Americans are doing to kind of tear them apart. And the people themselves who are going to hopefully be coming out. And the people themselves, you know, nobody talks about this, but the people themselves are actually very much a part of the undermining of the authority at the moment. They are giving us intel. They are telling Israel and America where targets are. This is what I hear from my sources, that people are basically, you know, tattling, what do you say? Tattletaling about the besieger here, knock them out. Right. So, I mean, I agree with you that it might take time, but I just don't understand what is going on in terms of their policy or their strategy at the moment, especially when you're talking to the Gulf countries, especially when you have now Saudi Arabia saying, oh, hang on, we might join in the offensive.
I think that what you're witnessing is death throes, right? Like, meaning they are going to, when you have an animal backed in a corner, it is going to attack, it is going to do anything that it can to save itself. And I think that's what Iran is doing. It's bringing in, from what I understand, 12-year-olds, offering them guns, asking them to be child soldiers. You don't do that if you're in a good footing.
Well, exactly.
They're desperately, throwing missiles at everyone, trying to hit anyone it can, taking them down with the ship. And it is trying very hard to keep, what does it have? It has the Straits of Hormuz. Like, so it's desperately trying to keep oil from flowing out, because that puts tremendous pressure on Trump, right? It's all about the markets. It's all about the cost of oil. It's all about the markets, even my father's flipping out about the markets, and like, what is my dad?
The Americans, it's just about the market.
Right, it's just like, what are you doing to my stock prices? And I feel like they are doing whatever cards they have, they're playing.
Yeah, well, they don't have a lot of cards left, do they, Emily?
I mean, no. I mean, that's why we see the activity that we see right now, and what you talked about with the energy and trying to manipulate the global market. I mean, this is one of the last things that they have the ability to do. So, of course, they're going to do it, and they don't care who it takes down with them. And that's actually been one of the arguments against some of the strikes on infrastructure that would also impact Iranian people, such as the power plants. Part of the reason it was controversial is precisely because of that. The regime, it actually helps them when the people are suffering, because people will be more upset about the fact the war is going on. And the longer that goes on, the more they will hopefully, in the eyes of the regime, turn towards the regime and view, the United States and Israel as the aggressor, when in fact, right now, I think the majority of the Iranian public is still very much in favor of what we see happening on the ground.
I agree, even though, of course, we're getting the detractors, the haters saying, no, this is going to turn them against America. I don't see how that can happen after 47 years of a brutal regime making these people's lives a misery. And forget the political repression, they don't have water. I mean, they have mismanaged the country because their priority has always been to export terrorism. And so they have mismanaged their entire country.
Look, that's entirely correct. But what's the problem? Let's say the support of the regime is at rock bottom. Let's say it's 10% of the public support the Islamic Republic.
Yeah.
Okay? It could be more, it could be less, but as a ballpark figure. If that's the 10% who've got the Kalashnikovs, who've got the guns, they can still do another massacre like they did in January. And that was a terrible massacre. Over 30,000 people in 2 days.
Yeah.
And so to say that the people can rise up, it's a process. It's not necessarily going to happen overnight. We all want it to happen. The Iranian people want it to happen, but it's not easy. We destroyed the Iranian regime's radar and missiles and navy and air force, but to do crowd control, you need none of that. You just need devoted thugs, ideological thugs with machine guns.
True.
And they can still do that. I would argue that maybe in the short term, you might see an Iranian Gorbachev, someone from the regime coming out and saying we're on the wrong path and we have to make changes. Maybe that is a more likely short-term scenario.
Well, this is, I think, what Trump was dreaming about. He says, I'll pick the next guy. In other words, he thought there was going to be a Delcy, like in Venezuela, who was just going to, get rid of Maduro. This woman who he can control comes and he can live with that, right? And I don't see the Islamic Republic of Iran having some type of transformational figure unless, of course, and this is very likely, they can lie about it and they can say, oh, I'm the transformational figure. But people aren't stupid, are they? I mean, on the other hand, we have these negotiations and the Pakistanis, they're so happy to be relevant again. They're like, oh, we'll do it at ours. Yes, we all know who you are. Meanwhile, neither the US or Israel or Iran are showing up to any of these negotiations. Of course, Israel was never going to be there, but either the US or Iran are going to be in these negotiations. And Witkoff is saying, well, we've given them a 15-point plan. So my question is, and I think we've discussed this before, is this another one of Trump's make a deal tactics because he's very good at this? Or is this genuinely another trial, another way to give them a ladder to come down from that very tall tree that they've put themselves up? What is it?
Well, I mean, I think it's both, but I still think it's misguided to make any deal. It may be that there is someone who agrees to something that even those, all 15 points, okay, great. What legitimacy do they have to control the country even within Iran? There's too many unknowns right now, and I'm not sure that any deal, even if they agreed, would be feasible, and we're not even at that point.
Yeah.
How are they going to enforce any of those things? Now, perhaps Trump is more concerned about Hog Island and the oil and these measures, and maybe those are the points he cares more about, kind of like we saw in Gaza with the fact that there were priority items, and there's some of them that still haven't been fulfilled, such as demilitarization of Hamas.
Yeah.
So it may be that we see something like that, but I totally agree with your assessment that even if we see a figurehead of some kind who is a short-term fix, this is definitely the beginning of the end.
Yeah,
and already, I do think that somebody needs to supply arms to some of the people on the ground in order to push back. I don't know how that can be done with the minimal amount of risk possible. I do think it needs to be done for precisely that reason. But I think, circling back to our initial topic, the defections, they are happening.
Yeah.
We don't know that they're happening at the highest levels or at a scale that we need in order to see, for example, the military, not the IRGC, but the military turn. That would be a very important step that could really change the game and build a new Iran. But in lieu of that, I mean, we're going to have to wait it out for now.
I saw yesterday Reza Pahlavi was at CPAC and he got an incredible standing ovation, which makes me still believe that the conservatives and the MAGA movement is still behind this war, however much we hear noises that people in, different commentators are against the war. I still think people are for the war. And Reza Pahlavi himself started, I think a year, maybe longer than a year ago, asking people to defect, and he would kind of take them in to him coming back. And so he's been organizing. It's not like, people don't give him enough credit. I don't know who the Iranian people want to choose, and it's up to them. But there is a leader in waiting. There is a leader that people are more or less in consensus.
Transitional leader.
A transitional leader.
Yeah.
He said it himself. And I'm pretty sure there's a plan. People want to portray this war as chaotic with no plan and no strategy. I don't believe it for a second. That is the propaganda of the regime that all these idiot shills in the West are repeating. There's no plan. It's chaos. It could be further from the truth. It's a month into it, and we've basically decimated their entire army. They're still throwing rockets. Yes, we're still living under fire. But I'm just wondering at what point are we going to do enough that then we can say to the people of Iran, and we haven't done that yet, neither the Americans or the Israelis, now is your time. And I think it's very unfair when people say, well, where are the Iranians? Why aren't they up? We haven't asked them, have we? Not yet.
We
told them the opposite.
On the contrary, both Trump and Netanyahu have said, stay at home, stay safe, and we will tell you when is the right time.
Exactly.
So to say that the Iranian people aren't coming out on the streets at the moment
is a lie.
On the other hand, when this is over, once again, I expressed before my concern that there would be enough people loyalists to the regime to come out and just massacre people.
Yeah.
Once again, they did it in January, they can do it in April, right? That's the truth.
Well, I think an even bigger concern is what we saw just yesterday and the day before, which is some of these proxy terror militias from Iraq who are making their way across the border into Iran. And Iranians know what this means. This means that those forces are going to be used to massacre Iranian civilians who are protesting, because that's what's happened multiple times before.
And because maybe the Iranian army or the people in the IRGC don't want to slaughter their own people.
Even besieged, they've had an increasing number of people just not showing notices.
That's exactly what Hezbollah did for the Assad regime. I'm sorry to take
No.
Hezbollah did that in Lebanon. From Lebanon, they came into Syria and they massacred Syrians for the Assad regime because they're not their relatives. They don't speak the same. It's not the same. So if Arabs are coming from, Iraqi Arabs, Shia, are coming to Iran, they can massacre people. They're not their family. They don't even speak their language.
So I think it's important for people who really don't understand, and I count myself as someone who does not understand, but even more so people who live in the West and don't live in this part of the world and don't study this part of the world beyond TikTok, to understand that these, Iraqis, Iranians, Hezbollah, Syria, they're not all the same people.
Yeah.
They are very different people with different religions, different loyalties.
Yeah.
And the mess that we're seeing now, on the one hand, you could say, oh my gosh, it's out of control, it has to stop. But the mess is also because when you hit the right nerve, things are going to explode until you can actually sever it, right? So Hezbollah is, I agree, I think also throwing out whatever it can. And the people in the north are suffering horribly.
Yeah.
They don't have time. Emily was there last week. She saw it herself. They don't have time.
Nothing.
We have time. We're like, oh, we have to go here. They don't have time. And they are suffering the fact that we're trying to finish Hezbollah, which is, of course, an arm of the Iranian regime. And so everything's going to look like a mess. I don't know that it's, not going to get worse before it gets better, but yes.
I want to respond to that. It's true.
You are welcome.
Drop my pen. It's true the people up the north, very, very difficult. And the people in Arad and the people in Beit Shemesh have gone through a very difficult time. But in the 12-day war last year, the June war, we had, I think it was 43 casualties from Iranian missiles.
Yeah,
okay?
we did.
This war now has been going on for over a month, and we're at a fraction of that. What are we, 12 or 10 people who've been killed since the, we had the terrible people in Beit Shemesh at the beginning, and we had the couple in Ramat Gan, and we had someone yesterday in Tel Aviv. But compared to what we went through last time, in a much shorter period, the Israeli people are not suffering as they had. Now, you're 100% correct that the people in the north, it's very difficult for them at the moment. But are people getting killed? Are there massive casualties? I used to sit in government meetings and people would make all these sort of graphs and things saying Hezbollah.
Yeah.
And then we could have thousands of missiles on Israel and we'll have hundreds of casualties.
Yes.
We're nowhere near that. So as much as we recognize the suffering, especially of people in the north, let's just remember there's not a war without suffering. And this is actually, right? And I express my sympathy. I don't want to be not empathetic to them. I am empathetic. I appreciate the pain they're going through. But from a national perspective, this is a shadow of the threat that they pose to the Israeli people.
So I think they would tell us that, wouldn't they? They would say, high rises in Tel Aviv will fall and there'll be thousands of people. And I actually read a report yesterday that we're not intercepting now 90%, we're intercepting almost 100% of the missiles coming through.
I think it's important to remember you can't only measure suffering in actual deaths.
No,
and
of course
the people
not.
of Israel and the children of Israel and the soldiers of Israel and the wives and the mothers are going through a lot. And there isn't enough infrastructure in this country to deal with mental health, to deal with the trauma. And when you're going to do something like that, you have to also take care of your people. You can't just count the number of actual deaths or maimings. That's how I feel as a citizen of this country.
I think the North is especially challenging for them because they had the, the 1-year evacuation, which was forced. It was not by choice. And they've been bombarded for such a long time by the same thing, and they feel like their needs have been ignored by the government. And so I think there's more going on there than just the actual rocket fire coming in. But
I agree.
I mean, you're absolutely right. The fact that we've improved so much in such a short amount of time is truly remarkable.
It's remarkable. We've learned to get better at defending ourselves as if we weren't already, the most defensive country in the world. It's really quite amazing and almost miraculous for those spiritually minded out there. I really do believe that. But Shoshana, you're saying something interesting about how the Middle East is not a monolith and people are different, and certainly the Persians are different to the rest of the countries in the Middle East. And I always say something else. I say this all the time, that in the Middle East, rhetoric and reality can be two different things. So do you think, Ambassador, that the Iranians really are begging for a deal, but they can't say that? So the bravado is, oh, you have to compensate us. You have to, comply to these conditions, our conditions. Do you think that behind closed doors they're really begging, or do you think they're full-on suicide mission now?
So I think this is going back to your first question about cracks in the regime.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are people in senior levels of the Iranian government who desperately want that ceasefire.
Yeah.
They think the ceasefire is the only way to maintain the regime, which they're very committed to.
Yeah.
They say that a ceasefire deal with the Americans will bring the lifting of sanctions. They'll make concessions on ballistic missiles, on nuclear, but they'll get the sanctions released, and that will give new blood to the regime.
Of course.
And then you have what I would call the kamikazes, for want of a better word, or jihad kamikazes, who say we're going to fight to the end, even though there's no way we can live this, right?
Yeah.
And
Which is Shia ideology.
we have no idea, none of us around this table know how this is going to play out between the two groups. Is a deal possible? We can discuss that later. But I'm sure there are some people, as I say, in senior leadership positions who want to go for a deal. And others, as I say, like the Japanese on the island 50 years you discover after the Second World War, who want to fight to the bitter end. I'm sure there's some of them as well.
Well, that's part of Shia ideology. Emily, you speak to a lot of people within Iran, the ones that have 5 minutes of internet now and again, or even less. I also get messages, you must get so many. Are people still grateful to us?
Very, very much so.
Really?
Very much so. I mean, of course, there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen, but their number one concern is that the attacks are going to stop. They don't want the attacks to stop on the regime. In fact, the last few days, specifically, I've been getting primarily requests to continue targeting besieged targets because why is Israel striking the steel factory? They should strike this instead. That's the kind of rhetoric that we're hearing. So they're very, very grateful both to the United States and Israel. But I do want to add one thing about the regime in general right now that I think is important for people in the West to understand, and that is that we see a lot of pressure on the United States and Israel to get things done quickly. Everyone wants us to wrap things up and finish the job and get it done and get done and get out of there. Except that's not how war works, one. And two, it's actually the regime thinks that it's in their interest to extend this as long as possible.
Of course.
It's part of the reason that they have, within the mountains there, they have several bases that, but we can't get to.
Yeah.
We can't, even the bunker busters, some of them we can't get to. Now, can we bury it enough that they can't get to it either? Yeah, possibly, but we can't really take out everything that's below. And that's why we're able to see some of these missiles going off, even though they've been seriously degraded. They can continue that for a long time, and they think that it's in their interest. Because if there's one battlefront that they win at, it's the narrative war. And they're using every tool that they have in their back pocket in order to use and mobilize everybody inside the Western world to destabilize and push back against support for this operation. And that's why we see so much rhetoric in the media, the mainstream media, and also social media and from pundits about this war and, no troops on the ground and, all of this obsessive rhetoric, despite the fact that the majority of people have no idea what they're even talking about. Or they don't know the difference between a wide-scale ground troop operation in order to change a regime in the style of Iraq versus special operations in order to hypothetically identify and bring back the highly enriched uranium. So there's a lot of talking going on right now, and a lot of it is coming from
from the push from the Islamic Republic itself. And we have to remember that and not, fall prey to their game that the West, frankly, all the West, has fallen for so many years.
They have so many propagandists.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. Every day there's a new propagandist. And it's just depressing. And it's also, who thinks that you can wrap up a war against the most poisonous regime in the world in a month? Like, people are just deluded. Nobody read history. I don't understand. And today, yes, it's going to be faster than the Second World War was, but it's not going to happen in a month. And that's what I keep reminding people. But anyway, on that wonderful note, we go to our very favorite segment. And every week we have more and more Scumbag of the Week. Okay. Ambassador Mark Regev, this is your first ever Scumbag of the Week. Wow. How do you feel?
So I chose someone, but maybe I'll let you people decide if he really qualifies for being a scumbag or not. I've chosen an Israeli, someone whose name I had never heard of before. And I was listening to my news podcast, and I was listening to Fareed Zakaria. He has his GPS program. And he said, my first guest this week is this Israeli. And once again, a name I'd never heard of before. And I thought, who is this? Often he has former prime ministers or former foreign ministers or former generals or former this or that. And suddenly there was this anonymous Israeli. And only afterwards I understood why he chose this anonymous Israeli. Lieutenant Colonel retired, reserve, Danny Citronvitz. He was on American TV telling the American audience that Trump's war is a mistake, that Trump doesn't understand Iran, that what he's doing is making matters worse, that the new leadership that will come after the Ayatollah who was killed will be more extreme, that there's no solution, there's no military solution, and a deal will only empower the regime. It was all negative, negative, negative.
So I'm saying that the war that actually meant to prevent Iran from crossing the threshold actually might be the war that actually will push Iran beyond the threshold towards a nuclear bomb. I think Netanyahu and Trump really thought that if you decapitate Khamenei, the regime will collapse. They didn't think what will happen next. So this is why we don't have off-ramps. We don't have a strategic way out of this escalation. So I think it goes back to the flawed understanding regarding Iran. And I want to add one other thing regarding that. Intelligence-wise, you can know where the leaders are, you can know where their deputies are, but sometimes you can see the trees, but you cannot see the forest. Meaning that even if Israel has an amazing operational intelligence on Iran, I don't think that strategically we understand how the Islamic Republic is actually working. And this has led to our problematic situation right now.
Apparently this man had a 24-year career in military intelligence. I respect him. It's important to hear different opinions. I agree with all that. But in America, there's a huge debate about to support this war or not to support this war. We know most Republicans support it, most Democrats are opposed, and the fight is over the middle. For an Israeli to go on and to say, I'm against this war, and President Trump, he didn't, in the interview, I swear, he didn't attack Netanyahu once. It was all Trump, Trump, Trump. I would argue that he needs to think about what he's doing. He can have his own opinion. I'm happy to hear his opinion. But to be part of a public campaign against the war in America. You know, Israel's opposition leaders, both Bennett, both Lapid, have been out there supporting this, saying this is a just and correct war. To go public on an American station to tell the American people to support those who are against this effort against the Islamic Republic, I think he needs to think twice. I think he may qualify as a scumbag. And I'd also like to say this,
He's too nice.
I will say the following. He has the right as an Israeli to say whatever he wants. But I, as an Israeli, have the right to criticize him.
Amen. He's definitely a scumbag, especially because these people, this is what they want. Nobody even looked at this guy until he started saying the right messages that CNN wants to show.
Yep.
This is what really angers me. He doesn't represent anyone here. So why on earth are you on American TV pretending you have a constituency behind you? Nobody agrees with him. He's certainly a scumbag. You're too nice.
Yes, Mark. Very
You're
nice.
too nice.
Very diplomatic.
Very diplomatic for the co-host of Israel Undiplomatic.
That's funny.
Emily,
So my scumbag this week is Alex Crawford from Sky News. And the reason for this, there's actually many reasons, but the reason for this week is because she decided to cover the airstrikes that the IDF conducted that took out Ali Shuaib, the Hezbollah intelligence operative, who also doubled as a journalist with a specially designated terrorist entity by the United States, the news network that he worked for. And of course, this attack brought about a lot of controversy, a lot of criticism against Israel, saying that we're targeting journalists and that, Israel is killing innocent journalists. And Alex Crawford was among those repeating this libel. And she did a whole report from the funeral saying that Israel claims that this person was in Hezbollah, but didn't provide any evidence for this attack that occurred against journalists. Let's take a look at what she had to say.
We're at a temporary graveyard in Beirut where the 3 journalists who were killed in a targeted attack by the Israeli military are being buried. There are, you can see, quite a large number of graves, all for people who have been killed.